In this video, we're breaking down 2 hours of Lois Griffin single-handedly tearing apart her own marriage. Let's get into it. First up, we got Bill and Peter's bogus journey. Peter Griffin was having a midlife crisis. He felt old, out of shape, and past his prime. Then he met Bill Clinton, the former president of the United States, and everything changed. Bill was cool, charismatic, and knew how to have a good time. They became instant best friends. Peter started spending every waking moment with Bill, going to parties, playing Dance Dance Revolution at Chuck E. Cheese, and living what Peter called the good life. For the first time in years, Peter felt young again. But Lois wasn't happy about this new friendship. She watched her husband come home night after night, exhausted from partying with Bill Clinton. Peter would stumble through the door with stories about their wild adventures, and Lois could see that Bill was becoming a bad influence on her husband. Peter was neglecting his responsibilities at home. He was acting reckless and immature. He was changing, and not for the better. Lois tried talking to Peter about it. She told him that Bill Clinton was nothing but trouble and that he needed to stop hanging out with him. Peter refused to listen. He accused Lois of being old and boring, comparing her to someone who wore frumpy sweaters and carried around old people candy. He said Bill made him feel alive in a way that Lois couldn't. The words stung, but Lois knew she had to do something. If Peter wouldn't listen to reason, she would take matters into her own hands. So Lois decided to go directly to the source. She would confront Bill Clinton himself and tell him to stay away from her husband. She drove to Bill's hotel, rehearsing what she would say. She would be firm but polite. She would explain that Peter was a married man with a family and that Bill needed to find someone else to party with. She walked into that hotel room fully intending to save her marriage. But that's not what happened. Instead of having a conversation about Peter, Lois ended up in bed with Bill Clinton. The show doesn't explain exactly how it happened or what Bill said to convince her. One moment she's there to talk, and the next moment she's sleeping with her husband's best friend. It was a complete betrayal of everything her marriage stood for. She didn't just cheat on Peter with a random stranger. She cheated on him with the one person Peter had formed a genuine friendship with, the one person who made Peter feel special and important. The affair didn't stay secret for long. Peter showed up at Bill's hotel room, expecting to hang out with his buddy. Instead, he walked in on his wife in bed with Bill Clinton. The look on Peter's face said everything. He was devastated. His best friend and his wife had both betrayed him in the worst way possible. Peter didn't yell or scream. He just stood there, processing what he was seeing. His whole world had just fallen apart. Lois immediately felt guilty. She knew she had done something terrible. She had destroyed Peter's trust, ruined his friendship with Bill, and damaged their marriage possibly beyond repair. The weight of what she had done hit her all at once. She had to make this right somehow. She had to fix what she had broken. So Lois came up with a solution that she thought was fair. She told Peter that he could sleep with anyone he wanted to make things even between them. She would allow him one affair, no questions asked, to balance out what she had done. It was her way of trying to make the situation equal, as if 2 wrongs could somehow make a right. Peter, still hurt and angry, accepted the offer. Peter thought about who he would choose. He could pick anyone in the world, any woman he wanted. And after considering his options, Peter made his choice. He wanted to sleep with Lois's mother, Barbara Schmidt. It was a calculated decision designed to hurt Lois the same way she had hurt him. If she could sleep with his friend, he would sleep with her mother. Peter went to Barbara's house, ready to go through with it. Surprisingly, Barbara was willing. She didn't see any problem with the arrangement. She was ready to sleep with her daughter's husband to even the score. But when the moment came, Peter couldn't do it. Despite everything Lois had done, despite the pain and betrayal, Peter realized he loved his wife too much to actually cheat on her. He couldn't go through with revenge. He couldn't sink to that level. So Peter forgave Lois. He decided that their marriage was more important than getting even. He chose to move past what she had done and try to rebuild their relationship. It was an incredibly mature decision, especially for Peter Griffin, who usually acts on impulse and emotion. He showed real growth and real love for his wife by choosing forgiveness over revenge. But Peter still had unfinished business with Bill Clinton. He went to Bill's hotel room one more time, this time to officially end their friendship. He was going to tell Bill that what happened was unforgivable and that they could never be friends again. Peter walked into that room, ready to cut Bill out of his life forever. And then, in true Family Guy fashion, Peter ended up in bed with Bill Clinton too. The episode ends with the absurd twist that Bill Clinton seduced Peter just like he seduced Lois. It's played for laughs, showing that Bill Clinton has such powerful charisma that nobody, not even Peter, can resist him. But if we look past the joke, what Lois did in this episode was genuinely destructive to her marriage. She went to Bill's hotel room with good intentions, wanting to protect her husband from a bad influence. But instead of standing firm and having a difficult conversation, she gave in to temptation. She made a choice that shattered Peter's trust and hurt him deeply. What makes Lois's betrayal even worse is the context. Peter wasn't just friends with Bill Clinton for no reason. Peter was going through a difficult time emotionally. He felt old and useless. He had injured himself trying to help Bill change a tire, which made him feel weak and past his prime. Bill Clinton represented youth, excitement, and possibility. Bill made Peter feel like he mattered, like he was still fun and relevant. Their friendship filled a real need in Peter's life. Lois knew all of this. She knew Peter was vulnerable and that this friendship meant something important to him, but she slept with Bill anyway. She took something that was helping Peter feel better about himself and turned it into a source of pain and humiliation. Peter couldn't maintain his friendship with Bill after that. The person who made him feel young and alive was now forever associated with his wife's betrayal. The episode also shows how Lois tried to fix the problem in completely the wrong way. Instead of genuinely apologizing and working to rebuild trust, she offered Peter a free pass to cheat. She treated their marriage vows like a transaction that could be balanced with equal acts of infidelity. She didn't seem to understand that what Peter needed wasn't revenge. He needed his wife to take responsibility for what she had done and show real remorse. Lois's actions in this episode reveal a pattern that appears throughout the series. When she makes a mistake, she often tries to fix it with a grand gesture or quick solution, rather than doing the hard work of actually addressing the problem. She wanted to make things even and move on quickly, rather than sitting with the discomfort of what she had done and allowing Peter to process his feelings at his own pace. The episode aired on March 11, 2007, as the 13th episode of the 5th season. It was written by Steve Callahan and directed by Dominic Polsino. The title is a reference to the movie Bill and Ted's Bogus Journey. The real Bill Clinton was asked to voice himself in the episode but declined, so Seth MacFarlane provided the voice instead. The episode was controversial when it aired, with the Parents Television Council calling it the worst TV show of the week. They criticized it for being depraved and disrespectful. Critics had mixed reactions to the episode. IGN's Asan Hake gave it a 7.1 out of 10, saying it had some truly hilarious moments, but that the main storyline took a backseat to too many random cutaway jokes. The episode was viewed in 8.05 million homes when it originally aired, according to Nielsen ratings. It got a 2.8 rating in the 18 to 49 demographic, which was slightly lower than The Simpsons that week. What's interesting about this episode is how it handles the aftermath of Lois's affair. In many sitcoms, an affair would be a major turning point that gets discussed in multiple episodes. Characters would go to therapy, have serious conversations, and work through the betrayal over time. But Family Guy is not that kind of show. By the end of the episode, Peter has forgiven Lois, and everything goes back to normal. The affair is never mentioned again in future episodes. It's treated as a one-time event with no lasting consequences. This is typical of Family Guy's approach to continuity. The show rarely carries plot points from one episode to the next. Each episode exists in its own bubble, and major events are usually forgotten by the following week. So while Lois's affair with Bill Clinton was a huge betrayal in the moment, it didn't fundamentally change their relationship going forward. In the next episode, Peter and Lois are back to their normal dynamic, as if nothing happened. But just because the show doesn't dwell on the consequences, doesn't mean they aren't there. If we think about this episode in realistic terms, Lois's actions would have caused serious damage to their marriage. Trust is hard to rebuild after infidelity, especially when the other person was your spouse's close friend. Peter might have said he forgave Lois, but actually moving past that kind of betrayal takes time and effort. The episode also raises questions about Lois's character. Throughout the series, Lois is often portrayed as the responsible one, the voice of reason who keeps Peter in check when he goes too far. She's the moral center of the family, the one who tries to teach good values to the kids and maintain some sense of normalcy in their chaotic household. But in this episode, she's the one who makes the terrible decision. She's the one who gives in to temptation and destroys trust. This creates an interesting contradiction in how Lois is written. On one hand, she holds everyone else to high standards and gets angry when they misbehave. On the other hand, she sometimes does things that are just as bad or worse than what she criticizes others for doing. She cheats on Peter in this episode, but in other episodes, she gets furious when Peter does something wrong. This double standard is something the show acknowledges occasionally, but doesn't really address in a meaningful way. Looking at the episode from Peter's perspective makes Lois's betrayal even more painful. Peter is not a sophisticated guy. He's simple, childlike, and wears his heart on his sleeve. When he befriended Bill Clinton, it was genuine. He wasn't trying to use Bill for status or connections. He just enjoyed having a friend who made him feel good about himself. Peter's emotional needs are basic and transparent. He wanted to feel young and cool, and Bill helped him feel that way. Lois could have handled the situation in so many better ways. She could have talked to Peter more seriously about her concerns. She could have tried to understand why Bill's friendship meant so much to him. She could have suggested they spend more quality time together as a couple. She could have addressed Peter's midlife crisis with compassion and support. Instead, she went straight to confrontation, and then when confrontation turned into something else, she made a choice that blew up her marriage. The fact that Lois slept with Bill Clinton specifically is significant. She didn't have an affair with a random stranger or an old boyfriend. She slept with the exact person she had gone there to warn away from her husband. It suggests that maybe part of her was attracted to the same qualities that Peter found appealing in Bill. Maybe she understood why Peter was drawn to Bill's charisma and charm, but instead of using that understanding to empathize with her husband, she acted on her own attraction and betrayed him. After Peter walked in on them, Lois had to face what she had done. She saw the hurt in Peter's eyes. She watched his friendship with Bill dissolve instantly. She knew she was responsible for causing him that pain, and instead of sitting with that guilt and really working through it, she tried to fix it quickly by offering him a revenge affair. It was a coward's way out. It was avoiding the real emotional work of rebuilding trust and showing genuine remorse. When Peter chose to sleep with Lois's mother as payback, it showed how much he was hurting. He wanted Lois to feel the same violation and betrayal that he felt. He wanted her to understand what it's like to have someone you trust betray you with someone close to you. But Peter's inability to go through with it showed that he's actually a better person than he gets credit for. Even when given permission and motivation for revenge, he couldn't do it because his love for Lois was stronger than his desire for payback. This episode is part of a larger pattern in Family Guy, where Lois's infidelity is treated as less serious than it would be in real life. The show has multiple episodes where Lois cheats on Peter or comes close to cheating. Each time, it's played for laughs or resolved quickly without lasting consequences. This suggests that the writers don't see Lois's affairs as truly destructive to the marriage, or at least they don't want to deal with the serious emotional fallout that would realistically occur. But from a storytelling perspective, what Lois did in this episode absolutely destroyed her marriage, at least temporarily. She took Peter's vulnerability and threw it back in his face. She betrayed his trust in the worst possible way. She turned his friendship into a source of humiliation, and she did it all while claiming to be concerned about his well-being. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and Lois's road to Bill Clinton's hotel room was no exception. The episode ends with the absurd revelation that Peter also slept with Bill Clinton, which in the show's logic somehow makes everything equal. But even that doesn't erase what Lois did. Her affair came first. Her betrayal set everything else in motion. She was the one who broke their marriage vows and destroyed Peter's trust. Peter's later encounter with Bill might have been funny, but it didn't undo the damage Lois caused. In the end, Bill and Peter's bogus journey shows Lois Griffin at her worst. She let her husband down when he needed her most. She gave in to temptation when she should have stayed strong. She betrayed trust when she should have built it up. And while the show moved on quickly and never mentioned it again, the audience saw exactly how Lois could destroy her marriage with one terrible decision. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Go Stewie Go. Peter Griffin noticed a gray hair on his wife Lois and made a joke about it. Then he made another joke, and another. For Peter, it was just typical behavior, the kind of thoughtless teasing he did all the time. But for Lois, those comments hit differently. She was getting older, and Peter's constant reminders about her aging made her feel invisible, unattractive, and unwanted. Every gray hair joke was another reminder that she wasn't the young woman Peter had married years ago. Then something unusual happened in the Griffin household. Meg came home and announced she had a new boyfriend. This wasn't remarkable by itself, except that Meg's track record with boyfriends was notoriously bad. Her previous boyfriend Justin had no legs. Before that, she had dated guys with serious problems. So, when Meg said she wanted to introduce her new boyfriend to the family, Peter and Lois were skeptical. But when Anthony walked through the door, everyone was shocked. He was completely normal. He was polite, well-groomed, friendly, and seemed genuinely interested in Meg. In fact, he was so normal that Peter and Lois couldn't believe it. They called the entire town to come see this miracle. Neighbors, friends, even the mayor showed up to witness Meg Griffin with a normal boyfriend. Dr. Hartman came over and gave Anthony a full physical examination to confirm that yes, he was indeed a perfectly normal young man. Anthony was charming and complimentary to everyone, including Lois. He told her she looked nice. He was respectful and kind. For someone who had been hearing nothing but age jokes from her husband, Anthony's compliments felt good. They made Lois feel seen and appreciated. But Peter didn't stop with the insults. Even after Anthony complimented Lois, Peter continued making jokes about her getting old. He couldn't read the room. He couldn't see that his words were hurting his wife. That evening, Peter and Lois went to bed early, but Lois couldn't sleep. She came downstairs and saw Meg and Anthony making out on the couch. Most mothers would feel protective or possibly uncomfortable seeing their daughter with a boyfriend, but Lois didn't react that way. Instead, she felt aroused. She watched them kissing and started fantasizing about being in Meg's place. She imagined herself making out with Anthony instead of her daughter. It was a disturbing fantasy, but Lois couldn't stop thinking about it. The next day, Lois needed someone to talk to about these feelings. She went to her neighbor and friend Bonnie Swanson to confide in her. Lois admitted that she was attracted to Anthony, her own daughter's boyfriend. She felt guilty about it, but she also felt something else: excitement. The attention from a younger man made her feel desirable again. Bonnie didn't judge her. In fact, Bonnie revealed that she herself had been having affairs with men she met online. Bonnie encouraged Lois, suggesting that maybe exploring these feelings wasn't such a bad thing. With Bonnie's words echoing in her mind, Lois made a decision that would blow up her family. She came up with a plan to get Anthony alone. She tricked Meg into leaving the house by sending her on an errand. Then Lois made her move. She approached Anthony, who was still at their house, and they started talking. The conversation turned flirtatious, and then they were kissing. Lois was making out with her daughter's boyfriend on the family couch. What makes this even worse is that Anthony was willing. He didn't resist or tell Lois this was wrong. He participated fully in the betrayal. They were both adults making a terrible choice, but Lois was the one who initiated it. She was the married woman. She was the mother. She was the one who should have known better and stopped this before it started. But Lois didn't stop. She kept kissing Anthony, kept betraying both her husband and her daughter at the same time. She was so caught up in the moment that she didn't think about the consequences. She didn't think about how this would devastate Meg. She didn't think about how this would damage her marriage. She only thought about herself and how good it felt to be wanted. Then the door opened. Meg had forgotten her keys and came back home. She walked in and saw her mother making out with her boyfriend on the couch. The look on Meg's face said everything. She was hurt, shocked, and furious. Her own mother had betrayed her in the worst possible way. Lois had taken the one good thing Meg had, the one normal boyfriend she had ever managed to attract, and ruined it. Lois tried to apologize. She attempted to explain herself, saying she never meant to steal Anthony from Meg, but that phrasing made things worse. By saying she didn't mean to steal Anthony, Lois implied that she could steal him if she wanted to. She made it sound like she was superior to Meg, like she could have any man she wanted while Meg should be grateful for whatever scraps she got. It was cruel and dismissive, even if Lois didn't intend it that way. Meg was done being treated like she didn't matter. She had spent her whole life being ignored, mocked, and dismissed by her family. But this was different. This was her mother actively betraying her. Meg told Lois that she was tougher than Lois thought. To prove her point, Meg reached into her own mouth and ripped out one of her teeth. She held it up, blood dripping, to show Lois exactly how tough she was. The gesture was violent and disturbing, and it scared Lois enough that she backed away. But instead of taking responsibility for what she had done, Lois went on the attack. She found Peter and confronted him. She accused him of driving her into Anthony's arms with his constant insults about her aging. She blamed Peter for making her feel so bad about herself that she had no choice but to seek validation from her daughter's boyfriend. She acted like Peter was responsible for her decision to cheat. This is a pattern that appears throughout Family Guy. When Lois does something wrong, she often finds a way to make it someone else's fault. In this case, Peter's insults were real and they were hurtful, but they didn't force Lois to make out with Anthony. She made that choice herself. She could have talked to Peter about how his words were affecting her. She could have suggested marriage counseling. She could have done literally anything else besides betraying both her husband and her daughter. Peter responded to Lois's accusations with unexpected vulnerability. He admitted that he only made jokes about her aging because he was insecure about his own aging. He didn't feel worthy of Lois. He was afraid she would leave him because he was getting older and less attractive. So he made jokes to cope with his fear. It was immature and hurtful, but it came from a place of insecurity rather than malice. Peter was scared of losing Lois, and ironically, his fear almost became a self-fulfilling prophecy. After Peter's confession, Lois realized something. Her husband wasn't trying to hurt her. He was just as scared and insecure as she was. They were both dealing with the reality of getting older, and neither of them knew how to talk about it in a healthy way, so they had hurt each other instead. Peter with his words, and Lois with her actions. They confirmed their love for each other and decided to move past this incident. They had sex on the couch, the same couch where Lois had betrayed him with Anthony. The episode treated this as a happy ending, with their marriage saved and their problems solved. But if we think about what actually happened, Lois did massive damage to multiple relationships in this episode. First, she destroyed her relationship with Meg. Meg already had a difficult relationship with her mother, but this betrayal took it to a new level. Lois didn't just hurt Meg's feelings or embarrass her. She actively pursued Meg's boyfriend and got caught in the act. That's not something a daughter easily forgives or forgets. Even after Lois and Peter made up, nothing was resolved with Meg. The episode didn't show Meg forgiving her mother or getting closure. It just moved on as if Meg's feelings didn't matter. Second, Lois cheated on Peter. Yes, they made up quickly and Peter forgave her, but that doesn't erase what she did. She kissed another man. She sought out physical intimacy with someone other than her husband, and she only stopped because Meg walked in and caught them, not because Lois had a change of heart. If Meg hadn't forgotten her keys, how far would Lois have gone? Would she have stopped at kissing, or would she have taken things further with Anthony? Third, Lois blamed Peter for her own choices. This is perhaps the most damaging thing she did to their marriage. By telling Peter that his insults drove her to cheat, Lois avoided taking full responsibility for her actions. She made Peter feel guilty for her betrayal. She made him think that his insecurity and fear were the real problems, not her decision to make out with their daughter's boyfriend. Peter accepted this blame and apologized, which allowed them to reconcile. But it set a dangerous precedent in their relationship. The episode suggests that Lois's affair was understandable because Peter had hurt her feelings. It frames her infidelity as a reaction to his insults rather than a separate choice she made. This is a problematic message. People in relationships hurt each other's feelings all the time. That's part of being human. But hurt feelings don't justify cheating. If Lois was upset about Peter's comments, she had many options available to her that didn't involve betraying him with their daughter's boyfriend. What makes Lois's behavior even more troubling is the specific target she chose. Anthony wasn't a random man at a bar. He wasn't an old flame from her past. He was actively dating her daughter. Lois knew that pursuing Anthony would hurt Meg. She knew it would damage their mother-daughter relationship. She knew it would be a betrayal on multiple levels. But she did it anyway, because she wanted to feel attractive and desirable. This shows a selfish side of Lois that the show doesn't always acknowledge. She's often portrayed as the responsible parent, the voice of reason in the family. But in this episode, she was completely irresponsible. She put her own desires above her daughter's well-being. She put temporary validation above her marriage vows. She prioritized how Anthony made her feel over the feelings of everyone else in her family. The conversation with Bonnie is also significant. When Lois confided in Bonnie about her attraction to Anthony, Bonnie didn't discourage her. Instead, Bonnie revealed her own affairs and essentially normalized the idea of cheating. She gave Lois permission, or at least didn't give her the reality check she needed. A true friend would have told Lois that these feelings were normal, but acting on them would be wrong. A true friend would have encouraged Lois to work on her marriage instead of destroying it. But Lois chose to listen to Bonnie's example rather than her own conscience. She chose to act on her attraction rather than resist it. And when the consequences came, when Meg caught her and Peter found out, Lois tried to deflect blame rather than own her mistakes. The episode aired on March 14th, 2010, as the 13th episode of the 8th season. It was written by Gary Janetti and directed by Greg Colton. The episode featured guest voices from Anne Hathaway and Lucas Grabeel. The main plot focused on Stewie cross-dressing to get a role on a children's television show, while the subplot dealt with Lois's attraction to Anthony. In typical Family Guy fashion, the episode moved quickly past the serious consequences of Lois's actions. By the end, Peter and Lois were back together, and everything seemed fine. But in reality, Lois had committed multiple betrayals that should have had lasting effects on her relationships. She cheated on her husband. She betrayed her daughter's trust. She prioritized her own ego over her family's well-being, and she blamed others for choices she made herself. The episode reveals an uncomfortable truth about Lois Griffin's character. When she feels insecure or unappreciated, she doesn't communicate with her husband or work on their relationship. Instead, she seeks validation elsewhere, even if it means hurting the people closest to her. She makes impulsive decisions based on her feelings in the moment, without considering the long-term consequences for her family. Peter's insults about her aging were wrong. He should have been more sensitive to his wife's feelings. He should have made her feel beautiful and loved instead of old and undesirable. But his mistakes don't excuse Lois's betrayal. Two wrongs don't make a right, and Lois's affair with Anthony was a separate wrong that she chose to commit. What's particularly sad about this episode is how it treats Meg. Meg is already the punching bag of the Griffin family. Everyone mocks her, ignores her, and treats her like she doesn't matter. This episode took that dynamic and made it even worse. Lois didn't just dismiss Meg's feelings or forget about her needs. She actively stole something from Meg, something precious that Meg rarely gets to have, a normal relationship with a decent guy. And when Meg expressed her pain and anger, the episode treated it like Meg was overreacting by pulling out her tooth. The focus stayed on Peter and Lois's marriage, while Meg's trauma was treated as a joke. In the end, Go Stewie Go shows Lois Griffin doing serious damage to her marriage and her family. She cheated on Peter with their daughter's boyfriend. She blamed Peter for her own choices. She betrayed Meg in an unforgivable way, and she got away with it because Peter forgave her quickly and the show moved on to other storylines. But the damage was real, even if the show didn't want to acknowledge it. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Big Man on Hippocampus, the Griffin family had a chance to be on television. Family Feud, the popular game show, was holding auditions in Quahog, and Peter thought this was their ticket to winning $5,000. He had big plans for that money. He wanted to build a cave in their front yard just so he could tell neighborhood kids not to go in it. It was a stupid plan, but that was classic Peter Griffin. The family made it onto the show. They competed against another family, going through rounds of questions where they had to guess popular survey answers. Richard Dawson was the host, recreating the original 1976 version of the show with all the old rules and traditions. One of those traditions was that Richard Dawson would kiss all the female contestants. It was something he did on the real show back in the day, and Family Guy recreated it for this episode. When it was time for Dawson to greet Lois, she didn't just politely accept a peck on the cheek. Instead, Lois grabbed Richard Dawson and gave him an intense, passionate French kiss. She bit his bottom lip. She whispered in his ear that she wanted him to wear her like a pinky ring. This wasn't a quick, polite kiss for the camera. This was Lois actively making out with another man right in front of her husband and children on national television. Peter stood there and watched his wife throw herself at Richard Dawson. The kids watched too. The whole country watching Family Feud that day saw Lois Griffin aggressively kissing the game show host. She said she had been waiting years for this moment, implying she had fantasized about kissing Richard Dawson for a long time. It was a complete disrespect of her marriage, done publicly and proudly. But the Griffins had bigger problems to worry about than Lois's inappropriate behavior. They were losing the game. Peter kept giving terrible answers during the speed round. The question was to name something you sit in. Peter kept saying chair, big chair, high chair, chair again. He couldn't think of anything else. The buzzer kept going off. Time ran out, and the Griffins lost the $5,000. Peter was furious. He had counted on that money for his ridiculous cave project. He confronted Richard Dawson, angry that they were leaving empty-handed. The argument escalated quickly. Peter grabbed at Dawson, and Dawson pushed back hard. He shoved Peter into the game show podium. Peter's head hit the podium with a loud crack, and he collapsed to the ground unconscious. When Peter woke up, everything had changed. He didn't remember anything. He didn't know who he was. He didn't recognize his family. He had no memory of his life, his home, or his past. The doctor diagnosed him with amnesia and said they had no idea how long it would last. It could be hours, or days, or years. Peter Griffin's entire identity had been erased by that one blow to the head. Lois tried everything to help Peter remember. She showed him around their house. She introduced him to his children. She explained who everyone was and what his life had been like. But nothing worked. Peter looked at his family like they were complete strangers. He had no emotional connection to any of them. His memories were simply gone. Then Lois had an idea. She caught Peter peeking in on her while she was changing clothes. Instead of being upset, Lois saw an opportunity. She told Peter it was okay because they were married. Then she decided to reintroduce him to sex. If memories wouldn't bring Peter back, maybe physical intimacy would. Lois took Peter to bed and showed him what married couples do together. The plan backfired spectacularly. Peter enjoyed having sex with Lois, but without his memories, he didn't understand what marriage meant. He had no concept of commitment or fidelity. He thought if sex felt that good with one person, it would feel even better with lots of different people. Peter decided he was now a bachelor who could sleep with anyone he wanted. The next night, Peter brought home another woman. He walked into the bedroom and told Lois to move over because he was going to have sex with someone else in their bed. The woman was Tiffany Thiessen from the television show Saved by the Bell. Peter genuinely believed this was acceptable behavior. In his amnesiac state, he thought he was single and free to do whatever he wanted. Lois was devastated. She had tried to help her husband, and instead she had created a monster. Peter didn't remember their marriage or their vows. He didn't remember falling in love or building a life together. He just remembered that sex felt good and he wanted more of it with different people. Lois realized she couldn't stay in this situation. She packed up the kids and moved out of the house into a cheap, run-down apartment. Word spread quickly that Lois had left Peter. Their neighbor Glenn Quagmire heard the news and saw his opportunity. Quagmire had been attracted to Lois for years. He had made inappropriate comments about her countless times. He had fantasized about being with her. And now, with Peter out of the picture due to amnesia, Quagmire thought his chance had finally come. Quagmire approached Lois at the grocery store one day. He snuck up behind her, making predatory jokes. He invited her to dinner, and Lois, hurt and angry and lonely, said yes. She agreed to go on a date with Quagmire. She agreed to spend time with the man who had spent years objectifying her and disrespecting her marriage. The date went well from Quagmire's perspective. He was charming, he was attentive, he made Lois feel wanted and appreciated. After dinner, they went back to Quagmire's house. They were heading somewhere dangerous, and Lois knew it, but she didn't stop it. She kept moving forward with Quagmire, step by step, closer to betraying her husband. They ended up in bed together. Lois was about to sleep with Quagmire. Her husband had amnesia, yes, but that didn't change the fact that she was still married. Peter's condition wasn't his fault. He hadn't chosen to forget her. He had been injured, and now Lois was using that injury as an excuse to cheat on him with their neighbor. But then, something unexpected happened. As they were in bed together, Lois said something that completely killed the mood. She told Quagmire that she trusted him. Those 3 words had a devastating effect. Quagmire's entire sexual identity was built on being untrustworthy, on being the guy who cheated and lied and manipulated. When Lois said she trusted him, it went against everything he was. His erection disappeared instantly. Quagmire panicked. He tried everything to get his erection back. He ran around his house naked, desperate, and embarrassed. He even tried shocking himself with a defibrillator, trying to jumpstart his body back into working order, but nothing helped. The moment was ruined, and Lois was spared from actually completing the act of cheating on Peter. Meanwhile, Peter had regained his memory. He had run into Ernie the giant chicken, his longtime enemy, and they had gotten into one of their epic fights. During the battle, Ernie kept hitting Peter in the head with various objects. Each blow knocked Peter's memory out and then back in again. By the end of the fight, Peter's amnesia was cured. He remembered everything about his life, including his wife and marriage. Brian found out that Lois was with Quagmire and rushed to tell Peter. Peter immediately went to rescue Lois from making a huge mistake. He burst into Quagmire's house and found Lois in Quagmire's bed. Peter apologized for everything. He declared his love for Lois. He begged her to come back to him, and Lois, realizing she still loved her husband, agreed. They reconciled while Quagmire was still desperately trying to get his body working again in the background. The episode ended with Peter and Lois back together as if nothing had happened, but something had definitely happened. Lois had betrayed Peter multiple times in this episode, starting from the very beginning on Family Feud. Her overly enthusiastic kiss with Richard Dawson showed a lack of respect for her marriage. She did it voluntarily, with no pressure or coercion. She wanted to kiss Richard Dawson, and she didn't care that Peter was standing right there watching. Then, when Peter lost his memory through no fault of his own, Lois made a series of terrible decisions. She reintroduced him to sex without thinking through the consequences. She didn't consider that Peter might not understand the commitment that comes with marriage if he had no memory of what marriage was. She jumped straight to physical intimacy without rebuilding the emotional connection first. When that plan backfired and Peter started acting like a bachelor, Lois had a right to be upset. But instead of getting Peter professional help or working with doctors to handle his medical condition properly, she abandoned him. She took the kids and left Peter alone in the house with his amnesia. She didn't fight for her marriage or stand by her husband during his medical crisis. She gave up quickly and moved out. And then, instead of focusing on her family or trying to help Peter recover, Lois went on a date with Quagmire. She knew exactly who Quagmire was and what he wanted. Quagmire had never hidden his attraction to her. He had made crude comments for years. Everyone knew Quagmire would jump at any chance to sleep with Lois. By agreeing to go out with him, Lois knew where things were heading. Lois went to Quagmire's house. She got into his bed. She was ready to have sex with him. The only reason it didn't happen was because of Quagmire's weird psychological hang-up about trust, not because Lois changed her mind or decided it was wrong. If Quagmire had been able to maintain his erection, Lois would have cheated on Peter while he was suffering from a traumatic brain injury. The episode treats this like a happy ending because Peter and Lois get back together. But if we look at what actually happened, Lois behaved terribly throughout the entire episode. She disrespected her marriage on national television. She made poor decisions about Peter's medical care. She abandoned her husband when he needed help, and she almost cheated on him with their neighbor. The episode aired on January 3rd, 2010, as the 10th episode of the 8th season. It was written by Brian Scully and directed by Dominic Bianchi. The episode featured a guest appearance by Dwayne Johnson, who appeared live action to simulate a censored sex scene using action figures of Peter and Lois. The episode was viewed in 8.1 million homes, according to Nielsen ratings. Critics gave the episode mixed to negative reviews. They praised some of the jokes and cultural references, but criticized the show for resorting to a cliché amnesia plot. The Family Feud segment was particularly popular, with viewers enjoying the recreation of the original 1976 set and Stewie's absurd answers to the questions. What makes Lois's behavior in this episode particularly problematic is that Peter's amnesia wasn't his choice. He wasn't neglecting her or mistreating her. He was injured. He had a legitimate medical condition that erased his memories and changed his personality. Instead of treating this like the serious medical emergency it was, Lois treated it like a personal betrayal. She acted like Peter wanting to sleep with other women was a choice he made to hurt her, when really it was a symptom of his brain injury. A good partner would have gotten Peter into intensive medical care. They would have worked with doctors and therapists to help him recover his memories safely. They would have protected him from making decisions he would regret once his memory returned. But Lois didn't do any of that. She got angry, moved out, and started dating someone else within what appeared to be just days of Peter's injury. The episode also glosses over the fact that Lois's actions at the beginning directly led to Peter's injury. If she hadn't been making out with Richard Dawson, Peter might not have been as angry about losing. If he wasn't as angry, maybe the confrontation with Dawson wouldn't have escalated to violence. Obviously, Richard Dawson was the one who actually pushed Peter, so he bears responsibility too. But Lois's inappropriate behavior with Dawson certainly contributed to the situation. Throughout Family Guy's run, the show has a pattern of having Lois cheat on Peter, or come close to cheating, then quickly resolving it without real consequences. This episode follows that pattern perfectly. Lois gets right up to the edge of infidelity, something stops her at the last second, and then she and Peter reconcile. The show treats it like everything is fine because they didn't technically have sex. But intent matters. Lois intended to cheat. She wanted to cheat. She was actively in the process of cheating. The fact that Quagmire's body didn't cooperate doesn't make Lois innocent. In the end, Big Man on Hippocampus shows Lois Griffin destroying her marriage through a series of increasingly bad decisions. She publicly humiliated Peter by making out with Richard Dawson. She mishandled Peter's amnesia by introducing sex too early. She abandoned Peter when he needed medical help, and she tried to cheat on him with Quagmire while Peter was still recovering from his brain injury. The episode played it all for laughs and gave them a happy ending, but the damage Lois caused was real and serious. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have the perfect castaway. Peter Griffin's fishing business was circling the drain like a goldfish in a flushing toilet. The guy couldn't catch enough fish to feed his family, which is basically like being a professional basketball player who can't dribble. So he did what any responsible employer would do when facing financial ruin. He fired his 2 Portuguese employees, Santos and Pascual. The method of termination? Shooting at them. Nothing says corporate restructuring quite like attempted murder via shotgun while your employees swim away for their lives. Peter showed up at home after this extremely normal workday with a turtle he caught, which he proudly announced he was going to hollow out and turn into an ashtray for Stewie, because apparently child safety regulations are more like suggestions in the Griffin household. Desperate times call for desperate fishing trips. Seamus, the salty sea dog with a peg leg and an eye patch who looks like he stepped straight out of a Pirates of the Caribbean audition that went horribly wrong, suggested that Peter head to Pelican's Reef if he wanted to find the fish he needed to save his business. Peter decided to take this advice, and naturally, he brought along his buddies Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland, who tagged along purely for the free beer. These guys signed up for a fishing expedition the same way people sign up for timeshare presentations. They had zero interest in the actual product. They just wanted the complimentary drinks. The 4 of them set sail with Peter at the helm, which is roughly equivalent to letting a toddler operate heavy machinery while blindfolded. They actually found the fish at Pelican's Reef. For about 5 minutes, everything was going according to plan, which in Peter Griffin's world is basically a statistical impossibility. The guys were pulling in fish left and right, probably celebrating their success with several of those beers they came for. But then reality remembered who it was dealing with and decided to course correct in the most dramatic way possible. A massive hurricane rolled in out of nowhere, because apparently the weather forecast in Quahog is about as reliable as Peter's decision-making skills. The storm hit them with the kind of giant wave you see in disaster movies, the ones where you know everyone's about to have a really bad day. The wave destroyed their boat completely, turning their fishing vessel into expensive driftwood floating in about 70 different directions. They would have drowned right there, if not for one thing: Quagmire's extensive collection of inflatable sex dolls. The guys built a raft out of these dolls, which is either the most resourceful survival technique ever documented or the most disturbing episode of Man vs. Wild that never aired, depending on your perspective. They floated on this raft made of adult products, drifting across the ocean like the world's most inappropriate parade float. This is the kind of survival story that would make even the most hardened wilderness expert go, "You know what? I have questions." While floating on the Sex Doll Express, they ran into another problem. They had zero food, no emergency rations, no fishing equipment that survived, nothing. Peter's solution to this predicament was to start eating Joe's legs. Yes, the paralyzed guy's unused legs became the emergency food supply. Peter literally cannibalized his best friend because he couldn't handle being hungry for more than a few hours, which tracks perfectly with his level of impulse control and complete absence of any survival ethics. Joe's legs were just sitting there, not being used for their intended purpose anyway, so in Peter's mind, this probably seemed like the logical choice. This is the same reasoning people use when they eat their roommates' clearly labeled leftovers from the fridge, except with significantly more ethical violations and probable prison time involved. Eventually, they washed up on a deserted island, where they would spend the next several months trying to survive, and probably trying not to think about the whole leg-eating incident. The island became their new home, complete with all the challenges that come with being stranded in the middle of nowhere with 3 other guys, none of whom have any useful survival skills between them. Back in Quahog, the families assumed the 4 men were dead. When you live in a town where death is an actual recurring character who shows up at inconvenient times wearing a bathrobe, this assumption probably felt pretty reasonable. A memorial service was held for the sailors, complete with Mayor Adam West doing the most Mayor Adam West thing possible, stabbing the cruel, unforgiving sea with a knife. Because that's definitely how you get revenge on an ocean. That's like trying to fight a cloud by throwing rocks at it, but with more theatrics and municipal budget concerns. At the memorial service, Chris started wailing emotionally for his father. Lois, in a moment of motherly compassion, calmed him down by acknowledging that he was upset, but then immediately telling him to knock it off because he was embarrassing her. Nothing says we're processing grief as a family quite like prioritizing social appearances over your son's emotional breakdown at his father's funeral. But the memorial service was just the beginning of the changes happening to the Griffin household. Brian stepped up to become the man of the house. He married Lois to support the family and got himself a job as a salesman at a Hummer dealership. Brian went from being the family dog who drinks martinis and writes unpublished novels to being the breadwinner with a sales job he clearly hated, which is basically the suburban dad experience speedrun. The Hummer dealership gig was the kind of soul-crushing sales job that probably made Brian reconsider every life choice that led him to this moment. He was working at a place that used to be a rainforest cafe, which means he was literally selling cars where animatronic elephants used to perform for children eating overpriced burgers. The symbolism there is almost too perfect. Brian and Lois were married, but they slept in separate beds, much to Brian's frustration. Brian wanted to consummate the marriage, because of course he did. This is the same dog who has spent multiple episodes trying to date human women and making everyone uncomfortable in the process. Lois kept him at arm's length, maintaining firm boundaries in this deeply weird arrangement. In one scene, Brian stormed out of the bedroom and announced he'd be in the basement, and when asked what he was going to do down there, his response made it very clear he'd be handling his frustration solo. Several months passed, with the guys still stranded on their island paradise that was actually a nightmare. They built shelter, found food, and tried to maintain their sanity while being stuck with each other 24 hours a day. Eventually, they decided they needed to satisfy certain needs, which led them to attempt group homosexual intercourse. This is where we need to talk about the fact that 4 straight guys stranded on an island decided that an orgy was the solution to their problems, which raises more questions than it answers about their entire thought process. The attempt failed, nothing actually happened, but it was happening right as a passing cruise ship spotted them. The cruise ship crew saw 4 naked guys in a pile on a beach, which is either the best or worst thing you can see through binoculars depending on your perspective. The cruise ship rescued them, taking them aboard and probably providing them with pants and therapy. Cleveland took time during the rescue to participate in skeet shooting on the cruise ship, except instead of clay targets, he shot and injured Skeet Ulrich, the actual actor, who was apparently a passenger on this ship. Only in Family Guy can a celebrity cameo double as an attempted murder joke. Joe got a new set of legs during this time. They came from a death row inmate who got the electric chair. The hospital somehow transplanted these legs onto Joe, which seemed like it would solve his paralysis problem permanently. Unfortunately for Joe, the death row inmate was also a paraplegic, so Joe received non-functioning legs from a dead guy and gained absolutely nothing from the experience except a really depressing medical bill. Peter finally returned home and met his family, who were surprised and overjoyed to see him alive. The reunion had all the hallmarks of a heartwarming moment. The kids were excited, everyone was emotional, and Peter was about to kiss his wife. Then Lois dropped the bomb that she had married Brian. Peter learned that his wife had legally married the family dog while he was gone, which is the kind of information that really should come with a warning label and maybe a fainting couch nearby. Lois explained why she made this choice. Brian had stepped up, supported the family, and been there when everyone thought Peter was dead forever. The explanation made sense from a practical standpoint, but the emotional impact hit Peter like a truck full of bricks driven by feelings. Peter left the house and got a room in a hotel in downtown Quahog. He checked into what was probably a mediocre hotel with bad cable and thin walls, processing the information that he'd been replaced by his own dog. Brian wanted to talk to Lois about the situation, but his motivations were transparently about trying to finally get into her pants rather than genuine emotional support. Brian had been living in sexual frustration limbo for months, and he saw this conversation as his opening. Peter decided to win Lois back through the universal language of terrible ideas. He went to the house, and Lois found him naked and lying on the couch. This was Peter's grand romantic gesture, full nudity on living room furniture. Somehow, against all logic and reason, the plan worked. Lois was convinced, and they had sex right there on the tipped-over chair. The furniture choice raises questions about their priorities and comfort levels, but they committed to it. Stewie walked in on them mid-act, found his parents going at it, and had the kind of reaction you'd expect from a baby genius walking in on that specific nightmare. But Stewie being Stewie, he didn't just walk away traumatized, he took out a camera and videotaped the whole thing, because apparently healthy boundaries are not taught in the Griffin household. The affair continued. The next night, Lois ran out of the house carrying a saddle, which is exactly the kind of detail that makes you realize this show has zero limits. Brian saw her leave with the saddle and started getting suspicious that something inappropriate was happening, which is hilarious considering he'd been pressuring her for sex since the day they got married. His suspicions were correct, but he needed proof. Stewie showed Brian the videotape. Brian watched his wife having sex with Peter, and the emotional devastation was immediate and complete. Seeing the tape crushed him because he'd spent months trying to build a life with Lois, working at a job he hated, sleeping alone in separate beds, and waiting for his moment. Then Peter comes back from vacation on Cannibal Island and immediately gets everything Brian had been working toward for months. The injustice of it probably stung worse than anything else. Brian went to the hotel where Peter was staying. He looked through the window and saw a silhouette of Peter and Lois having sex, along with a random silhouette of Alfred Hitchcock, because this show can't go 5 minutes without a cutaway reference. Brian was about to burst into the room and confront them about the affair, but then he stopped. He overheard Lois telling Peter that she had made a commitment to Brian and had to stay with him. Lois was choosing duty over desire, staying loyal to her marriage to Brian even though she clearly wanted to be with Peter. This moment probably should have made Brian feel respected, but instead it just twisted the knife deeper because he knew she was only staying out of obligation. Brian went home without confronting them. When Lois returned home, Brian told her that he knew about the affair. He explained that he understood she felt torn between her two husbands, and he told her to go back to Peter. Brian made the noble choice, stepping aside so Lois and Peter could be together, maintaining their friendship while dissolving their marriage. They mutually divorced right there, handling it with surprising maturity for a show where someone ate their friend's legs earlier in the same episode. The next day, everything returned to normal. The Griffin family was back together, Peter was home, and the bizarre interlude where the family dog was the stepdad was officially over. Everyone was glad to have Peter back, celebrating the return to their usual dysfunctional routine. Then, Lois decided to share one final piece of information with the room. She admitted that she was 1 day away from having sex with Brian. If Peter had come home just 24 hours later, she would have finally given in to Brian's months of pressure and taken him around the world, using phrasing that left zero ambiguity about what she meant. Brian's reaction to this revelation was immediate devastation. He'd done the right thing, stepped aside, let them be together, maintained his dignity throughout the whole situation. And now he learned that he was literally 1 day away from getting what he'd wanted the entire time. The cosmic timing of it was almost cruel. All those months of separate beds, all that frustration, all that patient waiting, and he missed his window by exactly 1 day because Peter decided to come home right before Lois's resolve finally broke. Brian told the family he'd be in the basement. Someone asked what he was going to do down there. His response was simple and completely expected. "What do you think?" The implication was obvious and uncomfortable, which is pretty much Family Guy's brand in a nutshell. Brian was going downstairs to handle his frustration the only way a cartoon dog who almost married his owner could alone, with his thoughts, and probably with some significant regret about his timing. The episode wrapped up with everything back to normal, which in this show means that everyone learned nothing, nobody grew as people, and the status quo was restored completely. Peter was home, Lois was his wife again, Brian was back to being the family dog, and the whole bizarre marriage situation was memory hold like it never happened. The 4 guys who got stranded never talked about eating Joe's legs or attempting an orgy. Nobody mentioned that Brian worked at a Hummer dealership for months. The entire arc of the episode disappeared into the void, where Family Guy stores all its continuity that it plans to ignore forever. This episode perfectly captured Family Guy's approach to absolutely insane premises. Take a normal situation like husband goes on fishing trip, add increasingly ridiculous complications like hurricanes and sex doll, rafts and leg cannibalism, throw in some interspecies marriage for good measure, resolve it all in the most awkward way possible, and then pretend none of it ever happened by the next episode. The show took the basic concept from Castaway and The Perfect Storm, mashed them together, added a love triangle between a man, his wife, and their dog, and somehow made it work as 20 minutes of television that people actually watched. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to The New Adventures of Old Tom. Peter Griffin managed to destroy Lois's underwear during one of his typical stunts, which is the kind of achievement that requires both commitment and a complete disregard for basic physics. Lois made the executive decision that the entire family needed to go to the mall so she could replace her undergarments, because apparently shopping for underwear is a group activity in the Griffin household. When Lois was ready to leave, Peter was doing what Peter does best, causing delays and making everyone wait. His inability to be on time for anything resulted in the family just leaving him behind at the mall, which is basically the suburban mom equivalent of, if you're not in the car, you're walking home. Lois drove away with the kids and left her husband stranded at a shopping center, which kicked off a chain of events that would reveal some uncomfortable truths about their marriage. When the mall closed for the night, Peter found himself locked inside with nothing to do. He decided to ride the kiddie train that he'd been denied access to earlier, because a grown man's dignity is a small price to pay for riding a tiny train meant for toddlers. Peter lost control of the train as it went around the mall, and instead of helping him, the mall staff just shut off the lights and went home. Peter spent the entire night riding that kiddie train in the dark, going in circles for hours, which is either a metaphor for his entire life or just another Tuesday for Peter Griffin. The next day, the news picked up Peter's overnight ordeal as a story. Quahog 5 News sent out their new reporter, Dallas Portland, to cover the incident of a man trapped on a children's train. Dallas was young, attractive, and had the kind of on-camera presence that made middle-aged housewives forget they were married. The wives of Quahog, including Lois, became immediately and intensely attracted to this new reporter. They gathered together as a group to watch Dallas on the news, forming what was basically a fan club for a local journalist. These women organized viewing parties to watch a guy read the news, which is the suburban equivalent of teenage girls camping out for concert tickets. Lois participated fully in this group obsession, leaving Peter alone to deal with his own issues. While her husband was processing the trauma of spending a night riding a kiddie train in the dark, Lois was too busy watching a hot reporter on TV with her friends. She prioritized her attraction to a stranger on television over supporting Peter, which sent a pretty clear message about where her focus was. Peter found himself abandoned, both literally at the mall and emotionally at home, replaced in his wife's attention by someone she'd never even met. Peter ended up complaining about the situation at the Drunken Clam to Jerome, because when your wife is ignoring you for a TV personality, the bar is really your only option. He found unexpected company in Tom Tucker, who was sitting there depressed and nursing his own grievances. Tom hated Dallas Portland with a passion because the young reporter was being groomed to replace him. The news station was planning to push Tom out in favor of the newer, younger model, which is basically what happens to every person over 40 in any visual medium. Tom was facing forced obsolescence, watching his career circle the drain because he'd committed the unforgivable sin of aging. Peter suggested they work together to improve Tom's image as a young, hip guy who could compete with Dallas. This was Peter Griffin's idea of a solution: take a middle-aged news anchor and try to rebrand him as someone cool and relevant. They decided to make a GoPro skateboarding video because nothing says, "I'm still young," quite like a 50-something man on a skateboard with a camera strapped to his head. The attempt went exactly as well as you'd expect. The video shoot ended with Peter being mauled by a bear, because apparently they chose to film in a location where bears just hang out waiting to attack mediocre skateboarders. Peter joined Lois to watch Tom's newly made-over version on the news. Tom tried to appeal to younger viewers by giving himself a face tattoo on live television, which is the kind of decision that requires zero planning and maximum regret. The tattoo attempt failed spectacularly because Tom was trying to tattoo himself near his eye during an active broadcast, showing the judgment skills of someone having a very public breakdown. The station fired him immediately, which makes sense because news anchor gives himself face tattoo on air is the kind of thing that makes advertisers nervous. Lois was upset with Peter about Tom's firing, even though Peter was trying to help the guy keep his job. She blamed Peter for Tom's downfall, conveniently forgetting that she'd been too busy drooling over Dallas Portland to notice any of this happening. Peter fired back by pointing out her obvious infatuation with Dallas, calling out the fact that his wife had been obsessing over another man for days. Lois couldn't really deny it, because the evidence was overwhelming. She'd organized group viewings of his news segments like he was starring in a prestige drama instead of reading teleprompter copy about local traffic accidents. But even after Peter confronted her about it, Lois still insisted that Peter needed to make things right with Tom, putting the responsibility back on Peter to fix the problem she was mad about. Peter visited Tom at his apartment to try to help, but Tom rejected his assistance completely. Tom had hit rock bottom and didn't want Peter's particular brand of help anymore, which was probably a smart choice given how the skateboarding video ended. As Peter was leaving the apartment building, he looked up and saw Tom standing on the rooftop, clearly preparing to jump. Tom Tucker was about to commit suicide because he lost his job to a younger, hotter reporter, which is admittedly a pretty dark turn for a cartoon comedy show about a talking baby and a dog who drinks martinis. Peter rushed to the rooftop to stop Tom from jumping, and Dallas Portland arrived right behind him to cover the potential suicide. Dallas showed up to film a man's death for ratings, which is journalism at its absolute most cynical. The news station sent him to get footage of their former anchor potentially killing himself, and Dallas came ready with cameras and the kind of fake concern that passes for empathy in local news. Peter made a split-second decision and announced that he was the one who planned on jumping, not Tom. He gave Tom the interview, letting the disgraced anchor get back on camera and do his job one more time. Peter apologized to Tom in the process, trying to make up for the face tattoo disaster and everything else. Tom interviewed Peter about why he wanted to jump, and Tom talked Peter out of committing suicide using his skills as a broadcaster and a friend. The moment was actually touching in a weird way, two guys helping each other out on a rooftop while cameras rolled. But then Peter got startled by a pigeon, because Peter Griffin can't go 5 minutes without something ridiculous happening. His startled reaction caused Tom to fall off the rooftop, turning this moment of redemption into another disaster. Tom plummeted toward the ground, probably regretting every decision that led to this moment. Luckily for Tom, he landed on other people, which broke his fall and saved his life. Those people probably didn't feel lucky, but Tom survived, so that's something. Meanwhile, during all of this marriage-damaging drama, Stewie had his own subplot happening. He and Brian were walking through the mall, and Stewie became attracted to Shelby, a biracial girl working at a jewelry store. Stewie tried to impress her by pretending to be rich, which is a bold strategy for a baby who technically has no income. He bought a $10,000 ring with Brian's credit card, planning to return it later after Shelby got off work. The plan was to look wealthy for a few hours and then get a refund before Brian's credit card statement arrived. When Stewie set out to return the ring after Shelby's shift ended, he discovered that Chris had swallowed it. Chris Griffin, the kid who once thought the plural of moose was meese, somehow managed to eat a $10,000 ring. Stewie and Brian now needed to get the ring back before Shelby's shift ended so they could return it to the jewelry store. The solution was fiber they needed to make Chris pass the ring naturally, which meant finding the highest fiber cereal possible. They went to Quahog Natural Foods to find something that would move Chris's digestive system into overdrive. While they were searching for the right cereal, they ended up surrounded by gray-haired lesbian art teachers who apparently hang out in the health food store cereal aisle. These women offered unsolicited advice about which cereal to choose, which is exactly the kind of demographic you expect to find hovering around the bran flakes and wheat germ. The health food cereal didn't work fast enough, so they took Chris to a fast food restaurant because if fiber won't do it, maybe grease and questionable meat will. They found the restaurant filled with many other patrons who were also there specifically to defecate or vomit, which paints a disturbing picture of this particular establishment's reputation and customer base. This restaurant was apparently where people went when they needed their digestive systems to purge something immediately. Time was running out, Stewie and Brian started fighting with each other over the pressure of the situation because nothing brings out interpersonal conflict quite like trying to make a teenager poop out expensive jewelry before a deadline. They eventually rushed back to the jewelry store, barely making it before Shelby's shift ended. However, things went wrong in the worst possible way. Shelby was still on duty behind the counter when they arrived, and Chris dropped his load right in front of her. Chris defecated in the middle of the jewelry store, in front of the girl Stewie was trying to impress during business hours. Shelby witnessed this nightmare scenario and immediately dumped Brian for lying to her about being rich, which seems like a very reasonable response to watching someone's brother take a dump in your workplace. The next day, things started wrapping up, with Tom Tucker getting his job back at Quahog 5 News. The rooftop incident where he almost died drew massive ratings, because nothing sells quite like potential tragedy. The news station brought him back because his near-death experience made him valuable again, which is probably the most cynical commentary on media culture the show ever made. Tom was rehired not because of his skills or experience, but because people tuned in to watch him almost commit suicide. Then, the episode dropped its final bomb on the Peter and Lois marriage. From outside the Griffin house, a mysterious man appeared, searching for Lois. This man had been watching everything unfold and came to a conclusion: if Lois could fall for a guy like Dallas Portland, and she was married to a guy like Peter Griffin, then he definitely had a shot with her. He announced that he was rich, because wealth is apparently the universal skeleton key to married women in Quahog. Then he whisked Lois away in his helicopter, because nothing says homewrecker quite like having your own personal helicopter. Lois actually went with him. She left with a complete stranger in his helicopter because he was wealthy and presumably attractive. Her husband was standing right there, having just helped save Tom Tucker's life and career, and Lois chose to fly away with a random rich guy instead. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask questions, didn't even pack a bag. The man showed up with money and aviation equipment, and Lois was gone. This ending revealed something deeply broken about the Peter and Lois marriage. Throughout the episode, Lois had been ignoring Peter to obsess over Dallas Portland with the other wives. She'd blamed Peter for Tom Tucker's problems while refusing to acknowledge her own infatuation with another man. She demanded that Peter fix things, while she continued prioritizing her attraction to a TV personality over her actual husband. And when Peter finally did something genuinely helpful and successful by saving Tom's career and life, Lois responded by leaving with another man entirely. The episode showcased a pattern of Lois treating Peter as disposable. She left him at the mall without a second thought. She abandoned him emotionally to watch another man on television. She blamed him for problems he was trying to solve. She refused to acknowledge her own inappropriate behavior while criticizing his. And ultimately, she physically left with a wealthy stranger, using the flimsiest possible excuse of him announcing his financial status. Peter spent the episode trying to help people and fix problems. He helped Tom Tucker try to keep his job. He rushed to save Tom from suicide. He gave Tom the interview that saved his career. He apologized and took responsibility for his mistakes. And his reward for all of this was watching his wife fly away in another man's helicopter. The message was clear. Lois had checked out of the marriage emotionally before she checked out physically. Her obsession with Dallas Portland wasn't just harmless celebrity attraction. It was a symptom of deeper dissatisfaction with Peter and their relationship. When the rich helicopter guy showed up, Lois didn't even pretend to resist. She went willingly because some part of her had already decided she was available. The episode treated this casually, wrapping it up as just another weird Family Guy moment. But underneath the joke was a genuinely dark commentary about their relationship. Lois was willing to abandon her marriage the second someone better showed interest. Peter's worth as a husband was constantly being evaluated against other men: Dallas Portland, the rich guy, literally anyone who seemed more appealing in that particular moment. This episode damaged the Peter and Lois marriage in ways that couldn't be easily repaired, even in a show that resets everything each episode. It revealed that Lois viewed Peter as replaceable. It showed that she would prioritize her own attractions over his feelings. It demonstrated that wealth and appearance could override years of marriage and family. And it proved that Peter could do everything right, help friends, save lives, show growth, and Lois would still choose to leave with a stranger in a helicopter. The casualness of it made it worse. Lois didn't leave because of years of built-up resentment or a dramatic confrontation. She left because a rich guy showed up and she felt like it. There was no deeper reason, no complex motivation, no tragic backstory, just a wealthy man with a helicopter and a wife who decided that sounded better than staying home with Peter. The episode ended with that image, Lois flying away in a helicopter, while Peter presumably stood there watching his wife leave him for a man she'd just met. The show played it for laughs, but the underlying message was genuinely disturbing. After everything Peter had been through in this episode, after helping Tom and facing his own marriage problems, Lois chose money and excitement over their relationship without even pausing to consider what she was doing or who she was hurting. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Meet the Quagmireers. Peter Griffin was sitting at the Drunken Clam listening to Quagmire brag about his sexual exploits, which is basically Quagmire's only conversation topic besides aviation and more sexual exploits. Peter started feeling like he'd missed out on enjoying the single lifestyle before settling down with Lois. He'd gone straight from being a teenager to being married, skipping the whole playing the field phase that Quagmire apparently never stopped living. This midlife crisis hit Peter hard enough that when death showed up at the bar on a false alarm, Peter made a wish that would completely derail his entire timeline. Death granted Peter's wish by sending him and Brian back to 1984 for one night. Peter appeared to everyone else as his 18-year-old self, giving him the chance to relive one night of his youth with all the knowledge of his adult brain. He had a scheduled movie date with Lois that night, the kind of date that probably seemed very important back when they were teenagers building their relationship. But Cleveland invited Peter to go party at a bar instead, and Peter made the choice that would change everything. He canceled his date with Lois, choosing to go out with Cleveland and enjoy the single life he felt he'd been missing. Peter spent the evening dancing and making out with Molly Ringwald, living out his fantasy of being young and free without any responsibilities or commitments. Death eventually appeared to return Peter to the present, ending his trip down memory lane. Back in the present day, Peter discovered that his past actions had created massive changes to the timeline. He found himself married to Molly Ringwald for 20 years instead of Lois. But the bigger revelation was that Lois had married Quagmire. In this alternate timeline, Lois and Quagmire had been husband and wife for 2 decades, building a life together that should have been Peter and Lois's life. The timeline also showed other changes Chevy Chase was hosting. The Tonight Show and Al Gore was president of the United States. The world actually seemed to be a much better place with Lois and Peter unwed, which is a pretty brutal commentary on their relationship's impact on reality itself. Peter begged Death to send him back to the past so he could undo his mistake and fix the timeline. Death agreed, giving Peter another chance to make things right. Back in 1984, Peter was determined to accept Lois's invitation and go on their date like he was supposed to. But Peter, being Peter, he stupidly blew his opportunity again and again. Every time he messed up, he asked Death for another do-over, creating a loop of failures that would make even Bill Murray from Groundhog Day feel better about himself. Peter kept choosing to go out with Cleveland instead of keeping his date with Lois, sabotaging himself repeatedly because he couldn't resist the temptation of hanging out with his friend. Death eventually refused to give Peter another chance. The cosmic entity, who literally controls life and death, had hit his limit with Peter's incompetence and decided enough was enough. Lois was upset with Peter for missing their date yet again, which makes sense because from her perspective, Peter had stood her up without a good explanation. She'd gotten dressed up, prepared for their movie date, and waited for a guy who never showed up because he decided drinking with Cleveland was more important. Peter and Brian had to sneak into the country club dance where Lois was spending her evening. Their mission was to prevent the kiss between Lois and Quagmire that would cause Lois to fall in love with Quagmire instead of Peter. When they found Lois at the dance, Peter tried to explain and win her back. Lois's response was direct and cutting. She told Peter that he'd had his chance and blown it. She wasn't interested in giving him another opportunity to disappoint her. From Lois's perspective, Peter had proven himself unreliable, and she'd already moved on to someone who actually showed up when he said he would. This is where the episode revealed something important about Lois and her approach to relationships. Peter had missed one date, admittedly a significant date, but still just one evening. Lois's reaction was to completely write him off and transfer her romantic feelings to Quagmire, who happened to be available at the country club dance. She fell in love with Quagmire that night based on a single kiss, replacing Peter entirely in her heart because he'd failed to show up once. The speed of her emotional pivot was remarkable. She went from being Peter's girlfriend with plans for a future together to being in love with Quagmire in the span of one evening at a dance. Peter almost gave up at this point, accepting that he'd lost Lois forever. Brian looked at Peter's photo of Stewie, Chris, and Meg, and saw the 3 children fading away from the picture because Lois and Peter not getting together meant those specific kids would never be born. This realization gave Brian the motivation to help Peter make one final attempt. Peter demonstrated his passion in the most Peter way possible. He punched out Quagmire and kissed Lois right there at the dance. The punch and kiss combo worked where words had failed. Peter then asked Lois to marry him on the spot, and she accepted. The fact that Lois accepted Peter's proposal after he punched his rival and kissed her says something interesting about what she responds to in relationships. The guy who missed their date and kept making excuses got rejected. The guy who threw a punch and took what he wanted got a marriage proposal accepted. Lois responded to the aggressive display of passion rather than to explanations, apologies, or attempts to communicate like adults. She needed Peter to physically fight for her before she'd give him another chance. Brian performed Rick Astley's "Never Gonna Give You Up" at the dance, doing well until he held a long note that shocked the audience. This musical interlude inadvertently rickrolled everyone at a 1,984 country club dance, which is either brilliant or terrible depending on your relationship with that particular meme. Peter and Brian returned to the present day and found that life was back to normal, with Peter and Lois married and their 3 kids existing. The only change was that Roger from American Dad now lived with the Griffin family for some unexplained reason, because time travel paradoxes are weird and unpredictable. The episode revealed several uncomfortable truths about the Peter and Lois relationship that couldn't be ignored even after the timeline was fixed. First, Lois was willing to completely abandon her relationship with Peter based on him missing a single date. There was no conversation about why he missed it, no attempt to understand what happened, no second chance offered willingly. She immediately moved on to Quagmire and fell in love with him that same night. The loyalty and commitment that should have been part of their teenage relationship evaporated the moment Peter failed to show up. Second, Lois married Quagmire in the alternate timeline and stayed married to him for 20 years. This means that, in that version of reality, Lois built an entire life with Quagmire, 2 decades of marriage, experiences, memories, and presumably children of their own. She was perfectly capable of being happy with someone else, and the world was apparently better off with that arrangement. The implication was that Peter and Lois being together actually made the world worse, since the alternate timeline showed improvements like better leadership and different entertainment options. Third, when Peter tried to fix his mistake and win Lois back, she made him work for it in a very specific way. She rejected his explanations and his apologies. She told him he'd blown his chance and refused to reconsider. Only when Peter resorted to violence and aggressive physical displays did Lois change her mind. She needed to see Peter fight Quagmire and dominate the situation before she'd accept him as a romantic partner again. Her criteria for choosing a husband apparently involved seeing who would throw punches over her, rather than who would communicate effectively and treat her with consistent respect. Fourth, Lois's emotional attachment to Peter was shown to be surprisingly fragile. One missed date was enough to completely redirect her romantic feelings to another person. She didn't pine for Peter or wonder what happened to him. She didn't give him the benefit of the doubt or wait for an explanation. She just moved on immediately, which suggests that her feelings for Peter at that age weren't particularly deep or resilient. If teenage Lois had really been in love with teenage Peter, one missed date wouldn't have been enough to make her fall for Quagmire instead. The episode also showed that Lois married Quagmire specifically because Peter didn't show up. She didn't choose Quagmire because of his unique qualities or because they had special compatibility. She chose him because he was there when Peter wasn't. Quagmire was the backup plan, the guy who showed up at the country club dance and kissed her when Peter was absent. This reveals something about how Lois makes relationship decisions, availability, and timing matter more than actual compatibility or long-term potential. Peter had to travel through time multiple times, get denied by death himself, sneak into a country club dance, punch his best friend, and make a grand romantic gesture just to get Lois to reconsider dating him. Meanwhile, Quagmire just showed up at a dance and kissed her once, and that was enough to make her fall in love and eventually marry him. The disparity in effort required shows that Lois holds Peter to different standards than she holds other men. Peter has to prove himself repeatedly and make dramatic displays, while other guys apparently just need to be present and willing. The episode's resolution suggested that Peter and Lois's relationship was always meant to be, but it also showed how easily it could have gone a different direction. Lois was ready to spend her entire life with Quagmire based on one evening at a dance. She was prepared to never speak to Peter again after he missed one date. The relationship between Peter and Lois existed because Peter fought for it, not because Lois was committed to making it work regardless of obstacles. When everything returned to normal at the end, Peter and Lois were back together with their original timeline restored, but the knowledge of what happened in the alternate timeline couldn't be completely erased. The episode showed a version of reality where Lois was perfectly happy married to Quagmire for 20 years. It showed Lois telling Peter he'd blown his chance and she wouldn't give him another one. It revealed that Lois's love for Peter as a teenager was contingent on him showing up and performing correctly, and that one failure was enough to lose her completely. The episode played this for laughs and wrapped it up neatly with a time travel reset, but underneath the comedy was a genuinely troubling portrait of their relationship's foundation. Lois's willingness to immediately replace Peter with Quagmire based on one missed date showed a lack of depth in her feelings for him. Her requirement that Peter literally fight someone before she'd reconsider him showed she valued aggressive displays over genuine connection. Her 20 years of marriage to Quagmire in the alternate timeline showed she could be equally happy with someone else. And her refusal to give Peter a second chance until he forced the issue showed that forgiveness and understanding weren't her default responses to relationship problems. Peter had to punch Quagmire and make a scene to win back a relationship that should have been strong enough to survive one missed date. Lois made him jump through hoops and prove himself worthy before she'd give him another opportunity. The power dynamic revealed in this episode suggested that Lois held all the cards in their relationship, deciding whether Peter was worth her time based on his ability to meet her standards and fight for her attention. Peter's feelings and explanations mattered less than his willingness to engage in physical combat and make grand gestures. The fact that this episode exists and shows Lois married to Quagmire for 20 years adds another layer to all their future interactions in the show. Every time Quagmire makes a move on Lois in later episodes, there's now the knowledge that, in another timeline, she actually married him and stayed with him for decades. The alternate reality actually happened in the episode's timeline before Peter fixed it. Lois was technically Quagmire's wife for 20 years, even if it was in a different version of history that got erased. The episode damaged the Peter and Lois marriage by showing how easily it could have never happened at all. Their relationship wasn't destiny or fate, it was the result of Peter making the right choices after several failed attempts, physically fighting his rival, and convincing Lois that he was worth a second chance. Without Peter's intervention and willingness to literally punch his way back into her good graces, Lois would have spent her entire life married to Quagmire, never looking back at what she could have had with Peter. The casual way she moved on from Peter to Quagmire revealed that teenage Lois's commitment to Peter was far more fragile than the show usually portrayed. She needed Peter to miss exactly 0 dates for their relationship to survive. One mistake was enough to lose her forever. She required physical violence and grand romantic gestures to reconsider someone she supposedly loved. And she built a perfectly functional 20-year marriage with Quagmire in an alternate timeline, proving that Peter was replaceable in every way that mattered. The episode also revealed that the world literally improved when Peter and Lois weren't together. Al Gore became president instead of whoever actually won in their original timeline. Chevy Chase hosted The Tonight Show, presumably bringing better quality entertainment to late-night television. The alternate timeline suggested that Peter and Lois's marriage had negative ripple effects on reality itself, making the world measurably worse just by existing as a couple. This means that every time Peter and Lois have a fight or disagreement in future episodes, there's the unspoken knowledge that Lois could have been happy with Quagmire instead. She chose Quagmire when Peter failed to meet her expectations once. She married him and stayed married for 2 decades in another timeline. She only came back to Peter because he literally forced himself back into her life through violence and dramatic displays. The foundation of their marriage is built on Peter proving he could fight hard enough to keep her, not on mutual respect, understanding, or genuine partnership. Lois's behavior in this episode showed that her loyalty was conditional and her feelings were transferable. She could redirect her love from Peter to Quagmire based on a single evening's events. She could build a life with someone else without apparent regret or longing for what might have been. She required Peter to earn her back through physical confrontation rather than communication, and she created a timeline where the world was objectively better off without her being married to Peter, suggesting that their relationship might be a net negative for everyone involved, including themselves. The time travel reset at the end fixed the timeline but couldn't erase what the episode revealed about Lois's character and her approach to relationships. She was willing to give up on Peter after one mistake. She was capable of loving and marrying Quagmire for 20 years. She valued aggressive displays over emotional connection. She held Peter to impossible standards, while apparently expecting nothing from herself in terms of patience or forgiveness. And she participated in creating an alternate timeline where everyone seemed happier without her and Peter being married. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to prick up your ears. Mayor Adam West was pursuing a pizza delivery man through Quahog using his cat launcher, which is exactly what it sounds like, a crossbow that shoots cats as projectiles. This is the kind of thing that happens regularly in Quahog, and nobody questions it anymore because Adam West's insanity is just part of the town's atmosphere. He launched one of his cats through the window of an adult video store, shattering the glass and creating what looked like a break-in situation. Griffin and his friends saw the broken window and came to the conclusion that someone had burglarized the place. Instead of calling the police or alerting the store owner, they decided to take advantage of the situation by walking in and stealing armfuls of pornographic videos, because teenage boys will always make the worst possible decision when presented with options. Chris brought his stolen porn home and started watching it, which is where Lois caught him. She walked in on her son viewing explicit adult content and had to have a conversation that no parent wants to have. But instead of just handling this as a family matter and talking to Chris about appropriate behavior, Lois decided to investigate how this happened in the first place. She discovered that Chris's school had no sex education teacher, which meant the kids were getting zero information about sex from any official source. The school was just hoping that teenagers would figure everything out on their own or that parents would handle it, which is basically setting everyone up for failure. Lois made the decision to volunteer as the sex education teacher at the school. She didn't consult with Peter about this choice. She didn't discuss whether this was appropriate or whether it might cause problems. She just signed up to teach other people's children about sex because she felt it was the right thing to do. Lois went into the classroom and started teaching the children about condoms and safe sex practices, giving them practical information about how to protect themselves if they chose to become sexually active. She approached sex education from a harm reduction angle, acknowledging that teenagers might have sex and therefore needed to know how to do it safely. The parents in Quahog absolutely lost their minds over this. They complained that Lois was teaching children about condoms instead of scaring them about sex the way she should have been doing. The expectation was that sex education should be primarily about frightening kids into never wanting to have sex, using horror stories and worst-case scenarios to make sexuality seem terrifying and dangerous. Lois's practical approach of, if you're going to do this, here's how to be safe, was completely unacceptable to the parent community. The school fired Lois from her volunteer position because she'd committed the unforgivable sin of giving teenagers useful information instead of trauma. The school brought in a minister to replace Lois and preach abstinence to the students. This minister delivered speeches full of anti-sex propaganda, telling the kids that sex was dangerous, sinful, and should be avoided entirely until marriage. The abstinence-only message resonated with many students who were already anxious about sex and looking for simple answers. Meg Griffin and her boyfriend were among those who took the abstinence pledge, vowing to remain virgins until marriage. The minister's message spread through the school like wildfire, with teenagers committing to celibacy based on fear rather than informed decision-making. Then Peter Griffin, Lois's own husband, became abstinent. Peter joined the abstinence movement and stopped having sex with his wife. Lois's crusade to teach proper sex education had backfired in the most personal way possible. Her husband was now part of the very movement she opposed. Peter was swept up in the abstinence craze that the minister had started, the same minister who had been brought in specifically because the parents didn't like Lois's teaching methods. Lois had created a chain of events that resulted in her own sexless marriage. The abstinence movement caused a predictable problem. Teenagers and adults who had pledged to remain abstinent still had sexual desires that didn't just disappear because they'd made a promise. The solution that swept through Quahog was ear sex, which became a massive craze as abstinent people looked for loopholes that would let them satisfy their urges without technically breaking their vows. The entire city became obsessed with ear sex as a way to maintain their abstinence commitments while still engaging in sexual activity. This bizarre trend was a direct result of the abstinence-only education that had replaced Lois's practical teaching approach. Lois tried to fight the ear sex craze immediately, recognizing it as a symptom of the larger problem with abstinence-only education. She burst into one of the minister's speeches while he was delivering more anti-sex propaganda to the students. Lois interrupted him in front of everyone and told the kids not to listen to what he was saying. She gave a counter speech about the good things about sex, emphasizing that sexual activity could be positive and healthy when done responsibly. She told them they should wear condoms if they chose to have sex, directly contradicting everything the minister had been teaching them. This public confrontation damaged Lois's standing in the community even further. She'd already been fired from her volunteer teaching position, and now she was actively disrupting the school's official sex education program by contradicting the minister in front of students. Parents who already thought Lois was too permissive about sex now saw her as someone who was actively undermining their children's moral education. The divide between Lois and the rest of the parent community became even wider. Meg's boyfriend ended up leaving her after seeing her naked. The relationship fell apart because of the abstinence pledge they'd taken, which had built up expectations and anxieties that made the actual experience of intimacy impossible to handle. When they finally got to the point of being naked together, Meg's boyfriend couldn't deal with it and ended the relationship. Meg blamed Lois for this outcome, holding her mother responsible for the chain of events that led to her breakup. If Lois hadn't tried to teach sex education at the school, the minister wouldn't have been brought in, Meg wouldn't have taken the abstinence pledge, and her relationship might have survived. The episode revealed how Lois's good intentions and strong convictions damaged her marriage and her relationship with her daughter. She'd volunteered to teach sex education without considering how the community would react. She'd given practical information about safe sex without recognizing that Quahog parents wanted fear-based education. She'd gotten herself fired, which led to the minister being hired, which led to the abstinence movement, which led to Peter refusing to have sex with her and Meg's relationship falling apart. Lois created a situation where her own husband joined a movement that opposed everything she believed about sex education. Peter became abstinent because of the minister who had been hired to replace Lois after she was fired for teaching about condoms. The direct line from Lois's decision to volunteer as a sex ed teacher to Peter refusing to have sex with her was clear and undeniable. She damaged her own marriage by setting in motion events that she couldn't control. The marriage between Peter and Lois suffered because Lois prioritized her beliefs about sex education over maintaining harmony in her household and community. She could have taught Chris about sex privately at home without involving the school. She could have advocated for better sex education through proper channels like school board meetings. She could have recognized that Quahog parents weren't ready for comprehensive sex education and adjusted her approach accordingly. Instead, she charged ahead with what she thought was right, got fired, triggered a massive abstinence movement, and ended up in a sexless marriage with a husband who had joined the very campaign she opposed. Meg's accusation that Lois was responsible for her breakup had merit. Lois's actions had started the chain of events that led to Meg taking an abstinence pledge that she wasn't emotionally ready to handle. The pledge created expectations and pressures that made Meg's first intimate experience with her boyfriend end in disaster. Her boyfriend saw her naked and immediately left because the abstinence movement had built up so much anxiety and expectation around sex that actually experiencing any form of intimacy became impossible to process. Lois had wanted to give teenagers good information about sex, but her methods had resulted in her own daughter having a traumatic experience that damaged her self-esteem and ended her relationship. The ear sex craze that swept Quahog was another unintended consequence of Lois's decision to teach sex education. People who had taken abstinence pledges were looking for loopholes, and ear sex became the citywide solution. This bizarre sexual practice spread because the minister's abstinence-only education created artificial restrictions without addressing the underlying human desires for intimacy and pleasure. Lois had tried to prevent exactly this kind of outcome by teaching about safe sex and condoms, but her firing had made the problem worse. Peter's participation in the abstinence movement meant that he and Lois were no longer having sex. This created tension in their marriage and left Lois dealing with her own sexual frustration while trying to fight against the movement that had captured her husband. She was essentially battling Peter every time she spoke out against abstinence-only education, creating conflict in her marriage over an issue that she'd introduced by volunteering to teach sex ed in the first place. The episode showed Lois as someone who was technically correct about sex education, but tactically incompetent about implementing her beliefs. She was right that teenagers need practical information about safe sex and condoms. She was right that abstinence-only education creates more problems than it solves. She was right that the ear sex craze was a symptom of unhealthy attitudes towards sexuality. But being right didn't matter when her approach had alienated the entire parent community, gotten her fired, triggered a massive abstinence movement, ended her daughter's relationship, and stopped her own husband from having sex with her. Lois's crusade damaged her marriage by creating unnecessary conflict where none had existed before. Peter had been fine with their sex life before Lois volunteered to teach sex ed. Meg had been in a functioning relationship before the abstinence movement started. The community had been muddling through sex education in their own inadequate way before Lois decided to intervene. Her intervention made everything worse for everyone involved, especially herself. The pattern revealed in this episode was that Lois often prioritized being right over maintaining relationships. She would rather be correct about sex education than preserve harmony with the other parents. She would rather make her point about condoms than keep her teaching position. She would rather publicly confront the minister than quietly work to change minds over time. And she would rather fight the abstinence movement than accept that her husband had temporarily joined it and work through that privately. Her marriage to Peter suffered because Lois couldn't let things go. She'd been fired from teaching sex ed, but instead of accepting that and moving on, she kept fighting. She burst into the minister's speech and contradicted him publicly. She continued her crusade against abstinence-only education, even as it created more problems in her own household. Peter was abstinent. Meg blamed her for the breakup, and the community saw her as a troublemaker. But Lois kept pushing because she believed she was right. The episode demonstrated that being right about an issue doesn't protect you from the consequences of how you handle that issue. Lois was correct about sex education, but her approach destroyed her effectiveness and damaged her relationships. She became the problem rather than the solution, alienating potential allies and creating opposition where she might have found support with a gentler approach. Meg's breakup was particularly painful because it showed how Lois's actions hurt her own children. Meg took the abstinence pledge because of the minister who replaced Lois. The pledge created unrealistic expectations that made Meg's first intimate experience traumatic. Her boyfriend left her after seeing her naked, damaging her self-esteem and making her feel rejected and unattractive. Meg blamed Lois for all of this, and she had a point. If Lois had handled the sex education situation differently, Meg might never have taken the pledge, and her relationship might have survived. The marriage damage extended beyond just the sexual aspect. Peter and Lois were now on opposite sides of a community-wide issue. Peter had joined the abstinence movement that Lois opposed. Every time Lois spoke out against abstinence education, she was implicitly criticizing her husband's choices. Every time Peter refused to have sex with her, he was rejecting Lois both physically and ideologically. The conflict that Lois had created by volunteering to teach sex ed had invaded their marriage and turned them into opponents rather than partners. The resolution of the episode likely involved things returning to normal, but the damage to trust and harmony in the marriage couldn't be completely erased. Lois had shown that she would pursue her beliefs even when doing so hurt her family. She demonstrated that she valued being right more than maintaining peace. She'd proven that she would create conflict in her marriage by taking actions that she knew would be controversial without consulting Peter first. These revelations about Lois's character and priorities stayed with Peter even after the immediate crisis passed. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Peter Asment. Peter and Lois went to watch Stewie's first musical together, which should have been a family bonding moment where they supported their youngest child's theatrical debut. Instead of recording Stewie's performance like any normal parent would do, Peter pointed the camera at Richard Dreyfuss, who was apparently also in the audience. Peter completely ignored his son's big moment to film a celebrity, choosing to prioritize getting footage of a famous person over documenting his own child's achievement. Lois watched this happen and apparently said nothing about Peter's failure as a father. She didn't insist he record Stewie. She didn't take the camera herself to make sure their son's performance was captured. She just let Peter do whatever he wanted while Stewie performed on stage with nobody filming him. Peter sent the Richard Dreyfuss tape to a TV station and got paid for it. This payment convinced him to become a full-time paparazzo, which meant he was going to spend his time stalking celebrities and invading their privacy for money. This was a major career change that would affect the entire family's life and income, but there's no indication that Peter discussed this decision with Lois first. He just decided to become a paparazzo and went ahead with it. Lois either approved of this questionable career choice or wasn't consulted about it at all. Either option reflects poorly on their marriage communication. Peter started recording Tom Tucker and Mayor Adam West as part of his new paparazzo career. When he tried to record Ollie Williams, the weatherman broke Peter's camera lens and his glasses in an act of justified retaliation against an invasive paparazzo. Peter came home with broken glasses and a broken camera, having been physically confronted by someone who was tired of being stalked. This should have been a wake-up call that Peter's new career path was dangerous and ethically questionable. Lois should have had a conversation with Peter about the risks of his paparazzo work and whether this was really how they wanted him to spend his time. But there's no evidence that this conversation ever happened. The next day, Peter went to work wearing contact lenses instead of his broken glasses. His boss, Angela, saw him without glasses and found him very attractive. She started sexually harassing Peter at work, making unwanted advances and inappropriate comments about his appearance. Peter was being victimized by his boss in a serious workplace sexual harassment situation that could have legal and psychological consequences. This was a crisis that should have involved his wife. Peter should have been able to come home and tell Lois that his boss was sexually harassing him, and Lois should have been supportive, outraged on his behalf, and helpful in figuring out how to handle the situation. But Peter didn't go to Lois with this problem. He didn't confide in his wife about being sexually harassed. He didn't ask for her advice or support. He didn't tell her that his boss was making him uncomfortable and threatening his job security through unwanted sexual advances. The fact that Peter felt he couldn't share this with Lois, or chose not to share it with her, reveals something broken in their marriage. Either Lois had established a pattern where Peter knew she wouldn't be supportive, or their communication was so poor that Peter didn't even consider telling his wife about a major workplace crisis. Angela eventually demanded that Peter visit her home, threatening to fire him if he refused. This was a clear case of sexual coercion, where Peter's employment was being held hostage to Angela's sexual demands. Peter faced the choice between losing his job and the family's income, or submitting to sexual harassment from his boss. This was an incredibly serious situation that affected the entire family's financial security. Lois should have been involved in this decision. Peter should have come home and told his wife that his boss was threatening to fire him unless he came to her house for sexual purposes. This was exactly the kind of crisis that married couples are supposed to face together. Instead, Peter went to Quagmire for help. He developed a plan with Quagmire where Glenn would hide in Peter's pants, and then Quagmire would have sex with Angela instead of Peter. This plan was absurd, unethical, and involved deceiving Angela about who she was having sex with, which is sexual assault by deception. But the more troubling aspect for the marriage is that Peter planned this with Quagmire instead of with Lois. Peter's go-to person for solving a sexual crisis wasn't his wife, it was his sex-obsessed neighbor. This shows how disconnected Peter and Lois had become, where Peter sought help from Quagmire for intimate problems rather than turning to his actual spouse. The plan failed when Quagmire found Angela repulsive and ran away, leaving Peter alone in Angela's house facing the same dilemma. Peter refused to have sex with Angela, choosing to maintain his marital fidelity even though it meant losing his job. Angela fired Peter for refusing her sexual advances, which is wrongful termination and illegal workplace retaliation. Peter came home unemployed because he'd been fired for refusing to sleep with his boss. This should have been a major family discussion. Lois should have been involved in figuring out what to do next, whether to file a lawsuit, report Angela to Human Resources, go to the police about the sexual harassment, or look for a new job. But again, there's no indication that Peter told Lois what happened. He lost his job because of sexual harassment, and apparently didn't discuss this with his wife. He didn't explain why he'd been fired. He didn't tell her that his boss had threatened him with termination unless he had sex with her. He kept this massive life event secret from Lois. Or Lois didn't care enough to ask questions about why Peter had suddenly lost his employment. Peter went to the Drunken Clam and watched an old movie starring Robert Mitchum. The movie character gave Peter a pep talk about how to be a real man according to 1,952 standards, which probably involved some deeply problematic ideas about masculinity and how men should handle conflicts. Peter was getting life advice from a fictional movie character in a bar instead of talking to his wife. He was processing his feelings about being sexually harassed and fired by watching old films with his drinking buddies rather than having a conversation with Lois about what he was going through emotionally. Peter returned to Angela's home with the apparent intention to beat her, which was his interpretation of what the 1,950 seconds masculinity advice meant. He was planning to commit physical violence against a woman, which is never acceptable regardless of what she'd done to him. This plan to assault Angela shows how poorly Peter was handling the harassment situation, making terrible decisions because he had no proper support system. If Lois had been involved from the beginning, she could have steered Peter toward legal recourse, therapy, or other appropriate responses instead of letting him spiral toward planning violence. When Peter arrived at Angela's house, he discovered her attempting to kill herself. Angela was in the middle of a suicide attempt, which transformed the situation from Peter's harassment crisis into a life or death emergency. Angela confided in Peter that no man had found her attractive for 10 years, which explained but didn't excuse her sexual harassment of Peter. She'd been lonely and desperate for male attention to the point where she'd resorted to coercing her employee into sexual situations and then attempting suicide when he refused. Peter's response to discovering his boss mid-suicide attempt was to set up a date for her with his friend, who was actually Peter wearing a disguise. He created a fake identity and took Angela on a date while pretending to be someone else. This deception led to them having sex, with Angela believing she was sleeping with Peter's friend rather than with Peter himself. Angela later revealed that she'd recognized Peter all along and knew it was him in disguise. She gave him his job back as a reward for having sex with her, which meant Peter's employment was still contingent on sexual activity with his boss. Peter had sex with Angela. Regardless of the circumstances, disguise, or motivations, Peter engaged in sexual activity with another woman while married to Lois. He cheated on his wife with his boss. The fact that he did this to save Angela from suicide or to get his job back doesn't change the reality that he had sex with someone who wasn't Lois. This was infidelity, and it fundamentally damaged the marriage, whether Lois knew about it or not. The episode never shows Lois learning about any of this. Peter was sexually harassed, fired, planned violence, discovered a suicide attempt, disguised himself, had sex with his boss, and got his job back, and apparently Lois was never informed about any step of this journey. She was completely absent from one of the most significant crises in Peter's work life. She didn't support him through harassment, didn't help him deal with unemployment, didn't stop him from planning violence, didn't know he saved someone from suicide, and wasn't told that he had sex with another woman. Later, at the Drunken Clam, Peter revealed to his friends that he'd convinced Mort Goldman to have sex with Angela using the same plan he and Quagmire had originally developed. Peter essentially pimped out Mort to Angela, arranging for Mort to hide in someone's pants and then have sex with Angela without her knowledge that it was Mort. This was another instance of sexual assault by deception that Peter orchestrated. He learned nothing from his own experience and immediately applied the same unethical plan using Mort as the substitute. Peter shared this information with his bar friends, but presumably not with Lois. He was bragging at the Drunken Clam about his scheme involving Mort and Angela, while his wife remained in the dark about everything that had happened. Peter's primary social and emotional support system was the guys at the bar, not his wife. He processed his experiences, made his decisions, and celebrated his solutions all with Quagmire, Joe, and Cleveland rather than with Lois. The absence of Lois throughout this entire ordeal damaged the marriage in multiple ways. First, it showed that Peter didn't trust Lois enough to confide in her about being sexually harassed. Second, it revealed that Lois was either unaware or unconcerned about major events in Peter's life like losing his job. Third, it demonstrated that Peter sought advice and support from friends rather than from his spouse. Fourth, it meant that Peter's infidelity with Angela went unaddressed, creating a secret that would sit between them even if unspoken. Lois's failure to be present during Peter's harassment crisis sent a clear message about the state of their marriage. When Peter faced unwanted sexual advances from his boss, he turned to Quagmire. When Peter lost his job, he processed it at a bar. When Peter decided how to handle Angela's suicide attempt, he made the decision alone without consulting his wife. When Peter had sex with Angela, Lois apparently never found out or never cared. At every step of this crisis, Lois was absent either because Peter didn't tell her or because she didn't ask. The marriage was damaged by this mutual failure of partnership. Peter failed to include Lois in a major life crisis, and Lois failed to notice or care that her husband was going through something significant. They were living parallel lives rather than being actual partners. Peter had entire storylines of harassment, unemployment, suicide intervention, and infidelity that happened without Lois's knowledge or involvement. Lois had a husband who was keeping massive secrets from her and making major life decisions without her input. The fact that Peter had sex with Angela while married to Lois cannot be overlooked, regardless of the circumstances. He was unfaithful. He engaged in sexual activity with another woman. The marriage vows of fidelity were broken. Whether Lois knew about it or not, whether Peter did it to save Angela's life or get his job back, the fundamental reality is that Peter cheated. This created a crack in the foundation of their marriage that could never be completely repaired. The episode revealed a marriage where the husband faces sexual harassment and doesn't tell his wife, where employment status changes and the spouse isn't consulted, where major decisions get made with friends at a bar instead of with a life partner, where infidelity happens and goes unacknowledged, where one partner lives through significant trauma and the other partner remains completely uninvolved. This isn't a marriage that's functioning, it's two people who happen to live in the same house but don't actually share their lives with each other. Lois's absence damaged the marriage by showing Peter that he was alone in handling his problems. Her lack of involvement demonstrated that she either didn't care about what Peter was going through or wasn't paying enough attention to notice. Her failure to be a support system meant that Peter turned elsewhere for help, creating emotional intimacy with his bar friends instead of with his wife. And her apparent ignorance of Peter's infidelity meant that a massive betrayal sat unaddressed, poisoning the marriage from within, even if it was never spoken about directly. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on to Breaking Out is Hard to Do. Lois Griffin was out grocery shopping when she found herself caught short on cash at the checkout. This is a situation that happens to people, occasionally miscalculating the total, forgetting to check the bank balance, bringing the wrong payment method. The normal response would be to put some items back, call Peter to bring money, or use a credit card if available. Lois chose none of these reasonable options. Instead, she pretended to return a ham to the meat department but actually hid it in her purse, committing theft rather than dealing with her cash shortage like an adult. This first theft was significant because it revealed something about Lois's character and priorities. She was willing to become a criminal rather than face the minor embarrassment of not having enough money at the grocery store. She chose to lie to store employees and steal from a business instead of asking her husband for help or simply leaving without the ham. This decision showed that Lois valued avoiding a small social inconvenience more than she valued honesty, legality, or the trust her family had placed in her as the responsible parent who handled household shopping. Lois enjoyed the rush from stealing so much that she didn't stop with one ham. The adrenaline and excitement of getting away with theft became addictive for her, and she indulged in a massive shoplifting spree. She escalated from stealing a ham to stealing multiple items across multiple stores, building a pattern of criminal behavior that put her family at risk every time she walked into a store. Each theft was a choice to prioritize her own excitement and thrill-seeking over her responsibilities as a wife and mother. Each stolen item was another secret she was keeping from Peter, another lie she was living. The shoplifting spree culminated in Lois stealing a Matisse painting. She'd gone from stealing food to stealing fine art, which represents a massive escalation in both the severity and value of her crimes. Stealing a famous painting isn't shoplifting anymore, it's art theft, which is a serious felony that could result in federal charges and years in prison. Lois knew this painting was valuable and important, and she stole it anyway because the thrill had become more important to her than the potential consequences for herself or her family. During an attempted theft of a car muffler, Brian finally confronted Lois about her criminal behavior. Brian showed Lois the evil of her ways, and she repented, recognizing that she'd become a kleptomaniac whose stealing was out of control. She made the decision to return the merchandise and make things right. This should have been the moment where Lois fixed her mistake, came clean to Peter about what she'd been doing, and dealt with the consequences of her actions as a family. Instead, Joe Swanson arrested her before she could return the stolen items. Lois was sentenced to 3 years in prison. 3 years is a substantial prison sentence that would take her away from her husband and children for a significant portion of their lives. Meg, Chris, and Stewie would spend 3 years growing up without their mother present. Peter would spend 3 years as a single parent trying to manage the household alone. The family's reputation in Quahog would be destroyed by having a convicted felon as a wife and mother. All of this happened because Lois chose to steal a ham instead of asking for help. Lois was resigned to serve her sentence, which means she accepted that she deserved to go to prison for what she'd done. She recognized that she'd committed crimes and needed to face the legal consequences. This acceptance of responsibility came too late after she'd been caught, tried, and sentenced. She hadn't been responsible enough to stop stealing before getting arrested, or honest enough to confess to Peter what she'd been doing before the police got involved. Her resignation to serve time was admirable, but didn't undo the damage she'd caused to her marriage and family. The Griffin household quickly plunged into filth and chaos in Lois's absence. Peter couldn't maintain the home, take care of the children, or manage the basic responsibilities that Lois had been handling. The house became dirty, routines fell apart, and the family structure collapsed without Lois there to hold everything together. This demonstrated how much the family depended on Lois, which made her crimes even more selfish. She'd risked her family's well-being and stability for the temporary thrill of shoplifting. During a prison visit, Peter saw the conditions Lois was living in and the impact her incarceration was having on the family. Instead of accepting that Lois needed to serve her sentence and figuring out how to manage the household better during her absence, Peter made an impulsive and illegal decision. He decided to smuggle Lois out of jail, which transformed Peter from the law-abiding husband of a criminal into a criminal himself. Lois's poor choices had now corrupted Peter, turning him into someone who would break the law and help a prisoner escape. Peter and Lois hopped into a laundry van and escaped from the prison. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision made. Under pressure, Peter had to plan this escape during his visit, figure out the laundry van timing, and coordinate with Lois to make it work. Both Peter and Lois chose to become fugitives rather than accepting the legal consequences of Lois's crimes. They chose to put their children in the position of having parents who were wanted by the law, destroying any chance the kids had of growing up with a stable home life. They ended up in Asiantown, which appears to be a neighborhood or district where they thought they could hide from the police. They rented a shabby apartment and started new lives, forcing their entire family to live as fugitives in poor conditions in an unfamiliar area. Meg, Chris, and Stewie were uprooted from their home, their school, their friends, and their normal lives because Lois had stolen a ham and Peter had broken her out of prison. The children had no say in becoming fugitives, but they had to live with all the consequences of their parents' criminal choices. Chris got a job working as a rickshaw driver, which meant he was working instead of attending school and living a normal teenage life. Chris should have been in high school, playing sports, hanging out with friends, and preparing for his future. Instead, he was pulling a rickshaw through Asiantown to help support his fugitive family because his mother had become a kleptomaniac and his father had broken her out of prison. The damage to Chris's education and development during this period was permanent. Peter became an unsuccessful sumo wrestler, which was apparently his attempt to earn money while living as a fugitive. Peter was failing at sumo wrestling while his family lived in poverty in a shabby apartment, all because he'd made the decision to break Lois out of prison instead of letting her serve her sentence. The family went from their comfortable house in Quahog to living in squalor as fugitives, and Peter's inability to succeed as a sumo wrestler meant they were probably struggling financially on top of everything else. Joe Swanson tracked them down despite their attempts to hide in Asiantown. Joe was doing his job as a police officer by pursuing fugitives who had escaped from prison, but Peter and Lois treated him like the villain in their story. They'd committed crimes, escaped from prison, and fled to a different area, and they acted surprised and upset when the police continued looking for them. They refused to take responsibility for their actions even when directly confronted by law enforcement. Joe pursued them in a rickshaw chase through Asiantown, which turned into an action sequence where the Griffins fled into the sewers to escape arrest. They were running through sewers like rats, dragging their children through literal wastewater to avoid facing justice for Lois's thefts and their prison break. This was the life that Lois's shoplifting had created for her family, hiding in sewers while being chased by police, with no home to return to and no future beyond running and hiding. Joe commandeered a police helicopter and followed them further. The chase escalated to the point where Joe was using department resources and risking his own safety to catch two fugitives who had made their situation exponentially worse by escaping. During this helicopter chase, Joe somehow ended up being followed by TIE fighters from Star Wars, which he managed to destroy before continuing his pursuit of the Griffins. Even with this bizarre sci-fi interruption, Joe remained focused on catching Peter and Lois. Lois finally decided to surrender and face justice. After dragging her entire family through prison breaks, fugitive life in Asiantown, sewer chases, and helicopter pursuits, Lois recognized that running wasn't sustainable. She chose to turn herself in, which was the right decision but came far too late. She should have accepted her prison sentence from the beginning instead of letting Peter break her out. She should have served her 3 years and come home to her family afterward, rather than creating this whole fugitive nightmare that made everything worse. Lois saved Joe's life when he slipped and was nearly swept off a nearby ledge during the chase. Joe was only in danger because he'd been pursuing Lois and Peter, which means Lois's criminal behavior had put Joe's life at risk. She saved him from a danger that existed because of her choices, which doesn't really balance the scales. Joe wouldn't have been on that ledge at all if Lois had just accepted her prison sentence and Peter hadn't broken her out of jail. In gratitude for saving his life, Joe somehow managed to get Lois's sentence remanded. This is where the episode really fails to hold Lois accountable for her actions. She'd committed multiple thefts, including stealing a Matisse painting, gotten sentenced to 3 years in prison, escaped from prison with Peter's help, lived as a fugitive, put her children through trauma, and led police on dangerous chases through sewers and by helicopter. The appropriate consequence was completing her prison sentence and probably adding more time for the escape. Instead, Joe used his influence to get her sentence completely remanded, meaning she faced no real punishment for any of her crimes. Life returned to normal for the Griffins after Joe got Lois's sentence remanded. They went back to their house in Quahog, resumed their regular routines, and pretended that none of this had happened. There's no indication that Lois faced any consequences for her shoplifting spree, her art theft, her prison escape, or putting her family through the trauma of fugitive life. There's no indication that Peter faced consequences for breaking a prisoner out of jail. They just went home and continued their lives as if Lois hadn't demonstrated that she was willing to become a criminal and put her entire family at risk for a temporary thrill. The damage to the marriage from this episode was severe and multifaceted. First, Lois had kept her shoplifting a secret from Peter, building a pattern of lying and hiding criminal behavior from her husband. She stole repeatedly without telling Peter what she was doing, creating a secret life that he knew nothing about. When your spouse is committing crimes and lying about it, that destroys the foundation of trust that marriage requires. Second, Lois's crimes resulted in a 3-year prison sentence that would have separated her from Peter for a substantial portion of their marriage. She'd chosen the thrill of shoplifting over staying present in her marriage and family. She'd prioritized her own excitement over Peter's need for a partner and the children's need for a mother. Even though she ultimately didn't serve the full sentence, the fact that she'd made choices that resulted in 3 years of separation showed how little she valued her marriage stability. Third, Lois's acceptance of Peter breaking her out of prison showed that she was willing to let him become a criminal to rescue her from the consequences of her actions. She let Peter throw away his freedom, his reputation, and his legal status to save her from prison time that she deserved. A partner who truly cared about their spouse wouldn't let them commit a serious crime like prison break just to avoid serving a sentence. Fourth, Lois dragged the entire family into fugitive life rather than accepting responsibility for her crimes. She let Meg, Chris, and Stewie live in a shabby apartment in Asiantown, forced Chris to work as a rickshaw driver instead of attending school, and made everyone live in constant fear of being caught by police. She put her temporary freedom above her children's well-being and her family's stability. Fifth, Lois's decision to finally surrender came too late to matter. She'd already put everyone through trauma, forced Peter to become a criminal, uprooted the children, and created chaos. Her eventual choice to face justice was the bare minimum of decency, and it only happened after she'd exhausted other options and realized running wasn't working. The episode revealed that Lois was willing to become a kleptomaniac, commit serious theft, go to prison, let Peter break her out, live as a fugitive, drag her children through sewers, and only surrender when she had no other choice. At every decision point, she made the choice that prioritized her own immediate wants over the long-term well-being of her marriage and family. She chose thrill over stability, lying over honesty, running over accountability, and self-interest over family responsibility. Peter's role in this mess showed that the marriage was damaged from both sides. He broke his wife out of prison instead of visiting regularly and supporting her through a difficult time. He chose to become a criminal and fugitive rather than stepping up to manage the household during Lois's 3-year absence. He taught his children that breaking the law is acceptable when it's convenient for your family. His decision to help Lois escape showed either misguided love or an inability to let her face appropriate consequences for her actions. The fact that everything returned to normal at the end with no lasting consequences meant that neither Lois nor Peter learned anything from this experience. They didn't have to rebuild trust after Lois's pattern of lying. They didn't have to work through the trauma of becoming fugitives. They didn't have to address why Lois became a kleptomaniac or why Peter thought prison break was an appropriate solution. They just reset to their normal lives, which means the damage remained unaddressed beneath the surface. The marriage between Peter and Lois after this episode carried the unspoken knowledge that Lois would steal when given the opportunity, that she would lie to Peter about serious matters, that she would put the family at risk for her own excitement, and that Peter would break the law to rescue her from consequences rather than letting her learn from her mistakes. Neither of them demonstrated the maturity, honesty, or responsibility that a healthy marriage requires. They'd both proven they would choose crime over facing reality, and they'd both shown they were willing to traumatize their children rather than accepting uncomfortable consequences. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe if you're enjoying this breakdown. Moving on, we have Lois comes out of her shell. Lois Griffin wasn't looking forward to her birthday, which is understandable since getting older can trigger anxiety and reflection about life choices. Brian suggested throwing her a surprise party to lift her spirits and celebrate the occasion. The family organized this party as a gesture of love and appreciation for Lois, trying to make her feel special and valued on her birthday. This should have been a moment where Lois felt supported by her husband and children, surrounded by people who cared about her. Peter read a poem at the party, which was his attempt to express his feelings for Lois and celebrate her birthday in a romantic way. Unfortunately, the poem had the opposite effect. It lowered Lois's spirits even further instead of making her feel better. Peter's poem apparently made Lois feel worse about aging, her life situation, or her relationship, though the specific content that upset her isn't detailed. What matters is that Peter tried to do something nice for his wife's birthday, and instead of appreciating the effort even if the execution was flawed, Lois let it push her into a crisis. Lois decided to turn her life around by adopting a different, younger lifestyle. She got a makeover and went on a shopping trip, completely changing her appearance and style to look younger and more trendy. This was Lois's response to feeling bad about her birthday, rather than talking to Peter about her feelings, working through her anxieties about aging, or finding healthy ways to feel better about herself. She decided to pretend she was younger than she actually was. She transformed her entire persona without discussing this major life change with her husband first. The makeover and lifestyle change caused conflict within Peter, who wasn't sure about the changes Lois was making. Peter was watching his wife transform into someone different, adopting behaviors and appearances that didn't match the woman he'd married. He certainly liked most of Lois's new persona, probably finding her more attractive with her updated look and more energetic attitude. Peter was trying to be supportive and go along with Lois's new lifestyle, even though he had reservations about whether this transformation was healthy or sustainable for their marriage. Lois's new lifestyle soon began to wear on Peter. What started as something Peter could tolerate or even appreciate became exhausting and difficult to maintain. Lois was living like a much younger woman, keeping schedules and energy levels that Peter couldn't match at his age. She was prioritizing her new lifestyle over her marriage and family, making choices that benefited her temporary happiness rather than their long-term partnership. Peter tried to keep up with Lois's changes, but the strain on him became obvious as she pushed further into her midlife crisis behavior. When Peter got tired at a party, he became a drag on Lois's good time. Peter had been trying to participate in Lois's new lifestyle by attending parties with her, even though this wasn't really his scene or his age group. He got tired because he's a middle-aged man attending parties designed for younger people, which is a natural and understandable reaction. Lois should have recognized that Peter was making an effort to support her new interests and appreciated his presence even if he couldn't maintain the same energy level. Instead, she saw him as a burden. Lois split off to party with younger girls, abandoning her husband at the party to go hang out with people half her age. She chose the company of young women over staying with Peter, making him feel rejected and unwanted. Peter had come to the party to be with Lois and support her new lifestyle, and she repaid him by ditching him to party with strangers. This was a clear message that Lois valued fitting in with younger people more than she valued her husband's companionship. Back home, Peter moaned about Lois's behavior. He was upset and hurt by how Lois was treating him and their marriage. Peter had tried to support Lois through her midlife crisis, attending parties with her and tolerating her lifestyle changes. When she abandoned him at a party to hang out with younger girls, Peter reached his breaking point and needed to vent about how Lois's behavior was affecting him. He was processing the pain of being rejected by his wife in favor of strangers at a party. A television report regarding Justin Bieber showed Lois hanging out with teen girls. Lois had escalated from partying with younger women to actively pursuing a teenage pop star, appearing on television in the process. Peter learned about his wife's behavior not through honest communication from Lois, but by seeing her on the news hanging out with teenage girls at a celebrity event. Lois hadn't told Peter where she was going or what she was planning to do. She'd kept her Justin Bieber plans secret because she knew Peter would object to her hanging around with teenagers and chasing after a pop star young enough to be her son. Lois sneaked into the Justin Bieber concert with the intention of seducing him. This wasn't just going to a concert to enjoy music. Lois actively planned to seduce a teenage celebrity. She was a married middle-aged woman plotting to cheat on her husband with someone young enough to be her child. The fact that Justin Bieber was a celebrity didn't make this acceptable or less serious. Lois was planning to commit adultery, and she'd chosen a teenage target for her seduction attempt. The intent to seduce Justin Bieber represented a complete betrayal of Peter and their marriage vows. Lois wasn't just having a midlife crisis with new clothes and parties, she was actively planning to be unfaithful to her husband. She'd gone to the concert with the specific goal of sleeping with someone else, showing that her midlife crisis had destroyed whatever loyalty she'd once felt toward Peter. The marriage vows about forsaking all others meant nothing to Lois when she was chasing the excitement of seducing a famous teenager. Peter burst into the concert and beat up Justin Bieber. Peter had to track down his wife to a concert venue, force his way inside, and physically confront the teenager she was trying to seduce. Peter resorted to violence because his wife was attempting to cheat on him with a pop star. The fact that Peter had to beat up Justin Bieber to stop his wife from committing adultery shows how completely Lois's midlife crisis had destroyed their marriage. Peter shouldn't have had to fight a teenager to keep his wife faithful. After Peter demanded that Lois come home, she refused. Peter asked his wife, who had just been caught trying to seduce a teenager, to come home with him and stop this destructive behavior. Lois's response was to refuse, choosing to stay at the concert rather than go home with her husband. She rejected Peter's reasonable request that she stop trying to cheat on him and return to their marriage. Lois was more committed to her midlife crisis fantasy than to her actual husband. Lois cited the names Peter had called her as her reason for refusing to come home. Peter had apparently said some hurtful things to Lois at some point, likely when he was frustrated with her behavior and feeling abandoned. Lois used these names as justification for refusing to come home, even though she was the one who had been caught attempting to seduce a teenager. She acted like Peter calling her names was worse than her planning to commit adultery. She took no responsibility for pushing Peter to the point where he said hurtful things by abandoning him at parties and pursuing other men. Peter apologized and admitted that he really liked Lois for who she really was. Peter took responsibility for his hurtful words and made himself vulnerable by expressing his genuine feelings for Lois. He told her that he appreciated her actual self, not the fake younger persona she'd adopted. Peter was trying to reach the real Lois underneath the midlife crisis behavior, reminding her that he loved the woman she actually was rather than the woman she was pretending to be. This was Peter extending an olive branch and asking Lois to come back to their marriage. When Justin Bieber was called back on stage, Peter was forced to go out and substitute as Conway Bieber. Peter ended up performing in place of the teenager his wife had tried to seduce, which is about as humiliating as a situation can get for a husband. Peter had to entertain a crowd at a Justin Bieber concert because his wife's attempt to sleep with the performer had created chaos. The entire situation had started with Lois's planned infidelity and ended with Peter suffering public embarrassment while performing as a substitute for the man his wife wanted to cheat with. Back home, Peter reiterated his love for Lois. After everything that had happened, the midlife crisis, the parties, the abandonment, the attempted seduction, the refusal to come home, the concert fiasco, Peter still loved Lois and wanted to make their marriage work. He told her again that he cared about her, trying to rebuild their relationship after the damage her midlife crisis had caused. Peter was extending forgiveness and offering to move forward together despite Lois's terrible behavior. Peter messed up Lois's age when expressing his love, which suggests he said something like, "I love you even though you're wrong age." This was an honest mistake made while Peter was trying to express affection for his wife. He'd just gone through the trauma of stopping his wife from cheating, performing at a concert, and trying to save his marriage. Getting her age wrong in that moment was a minor error that should have been forgiven or gently corrected. After Lois corrected him about her age, Peter snapped and told her to get out. Peter had reached his breaking point after trying to be supportive, apologizing for calling her names, expressing his love, and attempting to move past her attempted infidelity. When Lois focused on him getting her age wrong instead of appreciating everything Peter had done to save their marriage, Peter finally had enough. He told her to get out, which was Peter's response to realizing that Lois cared more about him saying her age wrong than about the fact that she'd tried to cheat on him with a teenager. The damage to the marriage from this episode was extensive and came entirely from Lois's choices. She'd taken Peter's birthday poem, which was meant as a gesture of love, and used it as an excuse to have a midlife crisis. She'd changed her entire lifestyle without consulting Peter about how this would affect their marriage. She'd attended parties where she abandoned Peter when he got tired from trying to keep up with her. She'd appeared on television hanging out with teenage girls without telling Peter where she was or what she was doing. Most seriously, Lois had planned to commit adultery with Justin Bieber. She'd gone to a concert specifically to seduce a teenager, showing zero respect for her marriage vows or her husband's feelings. When Peter stopped her from cheating and asked her to come home, she'd refused and blamed him for calling her names. She'd made herself the victim when she was actually the one attempting infidelity. She'd forced Peter to apologize to her when she was the one who should have been begging for forgiveness. Throughout the entire crisis, Lois never took responsibility for her behavior. She blamed Peter's poem for triggering her midlife crisis, as if his imperfect birthday gesture justified her attempting to seduce a teenager. She blamed the names Peter called her for her refusal to come home, as if his hurt words were worse than her planned adultery. She corrected Peter's mistake about her age, instead of acknowledging that he'd just saved their marriage by stopping her from cheating. At every turn, Lois deflected blame and avoided accountability for the damage she'd caused. Peter had tried to support Lois through her midlife crisis. He'd attended parties with her even though they weren't his scene. He'd tolerated her makeover and lifestyle changes. He'd apologized for calling her names when he was frustrated. He'd tracked her down at a concert to stop her from making a catastrophic mistake. He'd performed as Conway Bieber to cover for the chaos she'd created. He'd reiterated his love for her multiple times. And his reward for all this effort was Lois criticizing him for getting her age wrong. The episode revealed that Lois would rather chase teenage pop stars than appreciate her husband's love and support. She would rather party with people half her age than spend time with Peter. She would rather blame Peter for his imperfect poem than recognize her own destructive behavior. She would rather attempt adultery than work through her feelings about aging within her marriage. And she would rather focus on Peter's small mistakes than take responsibility for nearly destroying their marriage through infidelity. Lois's midlife crisis damaged the marriage by showing Peter that his wife's commitment was conditional. When Lois felt bad about aging, she didn't turn to Peter for support, she turned away from him toward younger people and celebrities. When Peter tried to keep up with her new lifestyle, she abandoned him at parties. When Peter called her out on her behavior, she used his hurt words as justification for her worse actions. And when Peter stopped her from cheating, she acted like he was the one who needed to apologize. The marriage couldn't survive this kind of one-sided effort, where Peter did all the work to save the relationship while Lois pursued her midlife fantasy. Peter had proven his love repeatedly throughout the crisis, and Lois had proven that she valued excitement and youth over loyalty and partnership. Peter's final snap, where he told Lois to get out, showed that even his patience had limits. After everything Lois had put him through, her criticizing him for a minor age mistake was the final straw that broke his willingness to keep trying. The episode ended with their marriage in shambles, held together only by Peter's willingness to forgive and Lois's eventual return to reality. But the damage was done. Peter now knew that Lois would abandon him at parties, appear on television without telling him, attempt to seduce teenagers, refuse to come home when caught, and criticize his mistakes while ignoring her own catastrophic behavior. Lois had shown Peter who she really was during her midlife crisis, and that person was someone willing to destroy their marriage for temporary excitement and the attention of younger people. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.